The howling wind swept across Cheyenne Station, carrying snowflakes that danced and swirled before settling on the wooden platform. Wyoming Territory, 1875, a year that would forever mark a turning point in Eleanor Sinclair's life, though not in the way she had imagined. She stood alone, a solitary figure in white against the gathering storm. Her wedding dress, once pristine and lovingly packed for the journey west, now hung limp and soiled around her ankles. Snowflakes clung to the delicate lace of her bodice and melted into dark spots on the silk. The bitter cold penetrated the thin fabric, but Eleanor barely noticed. The chill in her heart was far more severe than any winter storm. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the telegram for the 20th time, hoping that somehow the words might have changed. They hadn't. Hon uk hui bo, dung den, tai san da mut, kom konji de kungkup cho em. Thomas. The engagement cancelled. Don't come. Fortune lost. Nothing left to offer. 8 words that had shattered her carefully constructed future. 8 words that had turned her from a bride-to-be into a woman abandoned and alone over 1,000 miles from the only home she had ever known. The station master approached, his weathered face creased with concern beneath his frosted beard. "Miss, the last eastbound train has been cancelled. This storm's blown in faster than expected. Won't be another train until the weather clears." Eleanor nodded, too numb to speak. The man's expression softened further. "You got somewhere to stay in town. The Silver Creek Hotel might still have rooms, though. They'll be filling fast with all these stranded passengers." "Thank you." She managed, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I'll find something." As the station master retreated to his office, Eleanor sank onto a nearby bench, her trunk forgotten beside her. The reality of her situation began to sink in, stranded in a frontier town, with limited funds, no acquaintances, and nowhere to go. She closed her eyes, memories washing over her like waves. The orphanage in Boston, where she'd spent her childhood after losing both parents to typhoid. The years of determination and sacrifice to become a teacher. The 4 years of carefully saving every penny for a chance at a better life. Thomas Blackwell had seemed like that chance, a successful banker who had moved west to make his fortune, whose letters had painted pictures of a future filled with comfort and respect. A future that had evaporated like morning mist. A single tear escaped trailing down her cheek before freezing in the bitter air. Eleanor wiped it away quickly. Tears would not help. They never had. With resolve born of years of self-reliance, she gathered her small reticule and stood. The Silver Creek Hotel was her only option, though she feared her meager savings would not last more than a night or two. After that, she pushed the thought away, one step at a time. It had always been her way. The wind nearly knocked her back as she stepped outside the station. Snow swirled around her, clinging to her eyelashes and stinging her exposed skin. Through the white haze, the lights of Cheyenne flickered like distant stars, seemingly as unreachable as her dreams. The Silver Creek Hotel stood 3 blocks away, a journey that felt like miles in the blizzard. By the time Eleanor reached its doors, her lips were blue, and her fingers had lost all feeling. The warmth of the lobby washed over her as she entered, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke and cooking meat. The clerk behind the desk glanced up, his eyes widening at the sight of a woman in a wedding dress, snow-covered and trembling. "Room for the night," Eleanor said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "That'll be $2, ma'am." The clerk's eyes remained fixed on her unusual attire, curiosity evident in his gaze. Eleanor opened her reticule and counted out her remaining money. $1.75. Not enough. She had spent most of her savings on the train ticket west. I only have $1.75, she admitted, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The clerk's expression hardened. "Sorry, ma'am. $2 is the price. We've got folks coming in from the canceled trains. I can't make exceptions." Eleanor nodded, gathering what remained of her dignity. "I understand. Thank you." Back out in the storm, desperation began to claw at her. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the snow was falling heavier by the minute. With nowhere else to turn, she made her way back to the station. At least it would provide shelter until morning. The waiting room was crowded with stranded passengers, most huddled near the iron stove that glowed red in the center of the room. Eleanor found a corner seat away from curious eyes and whispered comments about her bedraggled wedding dress. As the hours passed, the crowd thinned. Families with children were taken in by local residents, while others found rooms in boarding houses or saloons willing to let people sleep on the floor for a few cents. By midnight, only a handful of travelers remained, including Eleanor. She sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap, fighting against the exhaustion that threatened to overcome her. The station would close at some point, and then what? The thought loomed large and terrifying. In the dim light of the station's lanterns, Eleanor allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding all day. She had nothing and no one. The future she had so carefully planned lay in ruins around her, as tattered as the hem of her once beautiful dress. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Eleanor Sinclair bowed her head and wept silently, her tears falling onto the wrinkled telegram still clutched in her hand. The station clock chimed 1 in the morning, its sound echoing through the nearly empty waiting room. Eleanor had dozed off, her head resting uncomfortably against the hard wooden bench. A sudden commotion jolted her awake. The station door burst open, bringing with it a gust of snow and wind. A small figure darted inside, followed by another identical to the first. 2 little girls, no more than 5 years old, with copper-red hair escaping from beneath woolen bonnets, raced across the floor. "Clara Charlotte, come back here this instant," a deep voice called from the doorway. Eleanor watched as a tall man entered, snow clinging to his broad shoulders and dark hair. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around his mouth that spoke of both laughter and hardship. But it was his eyes that captured Eleanor's attention, a startling shade of blue, deep as mountain lakes, filled with concern as he pursued the children. One of the girls, whether Clara or Charlotte, Eleanor couldn't tell, spotted her and changed direction, running straight toward the bench where she sat. Before Eleanor could react, the child had clambered onto the seat beside her, giggling breathlessly. "Found a hiding place," the little girl announced triumphantly to her sister, who quickly followed suit, climbing up on Eleanor's other side. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am," the man said, reaching them in 3 long strides. "Clara Charlotte, this is no way to behave. Leave the lady in peace." Up close, Eleanor could see the exhaustion in his face, the shadows beneath those remarkable eyes. A day's growth of beard darkened his jaw, and his clothes, though of good quality, showed signs of hard wear. "It's quite all right," Eleanor found herself saying. "No harm done." The man's gaze moved from her face to her attire, taking in the soiled wedding dress, the smudges of tears on her cheeks, the telegram still clutched in her hand. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a flash of sympathy he quickly masked. "Girls, come along now. We need to find Mr. Thompson." He held out his hands to the children. "But Papa, we just got warm," protested the one on Eleanor's left. "And the lady smells nice," added her sister. "Like flowers, not like cows." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips. The man looked mortified. "Clara," he admonished the second child who had spoken. "Manners." The station master emerged from his office, a ring of keys jangling in his hand. "Mr. Sullivan, there you are. Been waiting on you. Mighty late, to be out with the little ones in this weather. The stage got delayed by the storm, James. Just arrived. The man, Mr. Sullivan, turned back to Eleanor. Again, I apologize for my daughter's intrusion, Miss Sinclair. Eleanor Sinclair. She offered her name automatically, years of proper Boston upbringing asserting themselves even in her current state. The station master glanced between them. You two acquainted? No, Mr. Sullivan began, but the station master continued, his eyes settling on Eleanor. Miss here's been stranded by the storm. Was supposed to meet her fiancé, but... He gestured vaguely at the telegram in her hand, discomfort clear in his expression. Silver Creek's full up. Don't know where she's planning to spend the night. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. Her private misfortunes had become public knowledge, it seemed. She lifted her chin, slightly determined to maintain what dignity she could. I'll manage, thank you, she said firmly. The girls had gone quiet, watching the exchange, with wide, identical blue eyes, their father's eyes. Mr. Sullivan studied Eleanor for a long moment, a series of emotions crossing his face too quickly to interpret. Miss Sinclair, he said, finally, his voice low, I don't mean to presume, but it seems you're in a difficult position. I own a cattle ranch about 20 miles outside of town. We have a spare room and my housekeeper, Mrs. Mitchell, is in residence. If you need accommodation until the trains resume... Eleanor stared at him, speechless. The offer was completely unexpected and entirely improper. And yet what choice did she have? A night in the freezing station or perhaps on the streets once it closed. Mr. Sullivan, while I appreciate your concern, I couldn't possibly... Papa, one of the twins, Clara Eleanor thought, interrupted. Is the lady coming home with us? Can she tell us stories Mrs. Mitchell doesn't tell good stories? Hush, Clara, Mr. Sullivan said, though his tone was gentle. He turned back to Eleanor. Miss Sinclair, I assure you my offer is made with the utmost propriety. My daughters... He hesitated, then continued more quietly. They lost their mother 2 years ago. Since then, they've been without proper feminine guidance or education. In fact, I came to town today to inquire about a governess position I'd posted at the Mercantile. His gaze met hers directly. You look like an educated woman, Miss Sinclair. If you're stranded here with no immediate prospects, perhaps we could come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. Room and board, plus a fair wage, in exchange for teaching my daughters. Eleanor's mind raced. Was this divine providence or madness to consider going to a stranger's isolated ranch seemed the height of foolishness? And yet, what awaited her in Boston? The pitying stares of colleagues who had warned her against accepting a proposal from a man she knew only through correspondence, the struggle to regain her teaching position which had already been filled in her absence. Mr. Sullivan, she began carefully, your offer is unexpected, but I should tell you that while I do have teaching experience 2 years at Miss Harrington's School for Girls in Boston, I came west to be married. I wasn't seeking employment. Neither was I seeking a governess in a wedding dress at 1 a.m, he replied, a hint of wry humor briefly lightening his features. Yet, here we are. One of the twins, Charlotte Eleanor Guest, slipped her small hand into Eleanor's. Please come, the child said, her voice soft but earnest. We'll be good, won't we, Clara? Clara nodded vigorously, causing her bonnet to slip further off her copper curls. Very good. The best ever. Eleanor looked down at their hopeful faces, then back to their father. There was something in his eyes, not pity, which she couldn't have borne, but a kind of recognition, as if he too knew what it was to have life's carefully laid plans torn asunder. 2 weeks, she heard herself say. A trial period. Then, we can both decide if the arrangement is suitable. Relief washed over Mr. Sullivan's face. "Fair enough. I have the wagon outside. We should leave soon if we want to reach the ranch before the worst of the storm hits." As Eleanor gathered her few belongings, a question that had been hovering at the edge of her consciousness suddenly crystallized. "Mr. Sullivan," she asked, "you said you came to town to inquire about a governess position, yet you also mentioned arriving on the delayed stage. I don't understand." A shadow crossed his face. "I had two purposes in town today, Miss Sinclair. The stage brought me from Denver, where I had business with a bank. It didn't go as hoped." He glanced at his daughters, clearly unwilling to elaborate in their presence. "We should go. The storm's getting worse." As Eleanor followed the Sullivan family out into the swirling snow, the station master caught her arm. "Miss," he said quietly, "I know Garrett Sullivan. He's a good man. Lost his wife to pneumonia 2 winters back. Those little girls need someone like you." Eleanor nodded, strangely comforted by the endorsement. As she stepped into the bitter night, the telegram slipped from her fingers, carried away by the wind. She didn't try to retrieve it. Some messages weren't worth keeping. The Sullivan wagon creaked and swayed through the blizzard, its sturdy wheels struggling against the deepening snow. Eleanor sat on the bench seat beside Garrett Sullivan, the twins huddled between them under a thick buffalo robe. The journey had begun in near silence, save for the howling wind and occasional directions Mr. Sullivan murmured to his team of horses. Eleanor's thoughts whirled like the snowflakes around them. Had she lost her mind, agreeing to this arrangement? 20 miles from town with a man she'd just met, regardless of the station master's endorsement, seemed the height of recklessness. Yet, the alternatives, a night in the freezing station or worse, had left her little choice. "You're thinking you've made a terrible mistake," Mr. Sullivan said suddenly, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Eleanor turned to him, startled. "I beg your pardon." "Your expression," he explained. "I recognize it. It's the same one I wore when I first came to Wyoming Territory 10 years ago, wondering if I'd lost my mind, leaving everything familiar behind." She couldn't help but smile slightly at his perception. "And had you lost your mind, I mean?" "Perhaps," he admitted, a hint of humor warming his voice, "but it was the best mistake I ever made." He gestured ahead, though nothing was visible through the curtain of snow. "Sullivan Ranch, 3,000 acres, 500 head of cattle. My father started with nothing but 50 acres and 10 cows. Now it's one of the most prosperous spreads in the county." Pride resonated in his words, tempered with something else, a wistfulness, perhaps. "It sounds impressive," Eleanor said sincerely. "It's hard work," he replied. "Harder since—" He glanced down at the girls now sleeping against each other beneath the robe. "Well, it's never easy taming this land, but there's freedom in it. Being your own master." They lapsed into silence again. Eleanor found herself studying his profile in the dim light, the strong line of his jaw, the furrow between his brows that seemed permanent, the way his eyes constantly scanned the trail ahead, alert for dangers. There was a steadiness to him that she found oddly reassuring. "The twins," she ventured after a while. "Clara and Charlotte. How do you tell them apart?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Charlotte has a small freckle beneath her right eye, and Clara speaks first, usually. Charlotte thinks before she talks. They seem bright, too bright for their own good sometimes," he said, but the fondness in his tone belied any real complaint. "Their mother was the same way, always asking questions, reading everything she could get her hands on." The mention of his late wife seemed to close a door. His expression shuttered, and he focused intently on guiding the horses through a particularly deep drift. As the hours passed, the storm intensified. Snow swirled around them in blinding sheets, and the cold penetrated Eleanor's thin clothing, despite the buffalo robe. The twins stirred occasionally, whimpering in their sleep, and Eleanor found herself drawing them closer, sharing what little warmth she had. "We're not far now," Mr. Sullivan assured her, though the words were nearly lost in the howling wind. "Another mile or so." Eleanor nodded, too cold to speak. She had lost all feeling in her feet and hands, and exhaustion weighed on her like a physical burden. Only the need to stay upright for the children's sake kept her from slumping against the wagon's side. "Miss Sinclair." Mr. Sullivan's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Eleanor." The use of her given name penetrated the fog closing in around her. She turned toward him, struggling to focus. "You need to stay awake," he said urgently. "The cold, it's dangerous to sleep." "I'm trying." She managed her lips stiff with cold. In a swift motion, he pulled the reins with one hand and wrapped his other arm around her shoulders, drawing her and the children closer to his side. The sudden warmth of his body against hers was shocking, improper, and absolutely necessary. "Forgive the liberty," he murmured, "but I won't have you freezing to death before we even reach the ranch." Eleanor wanted to protest, to maintain the propriety she'd been raised to value. But survival trumped social niceties, and she found herself leaning into his solid warmth with shameless gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. They continued that way for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. Gradually, through the swirling snowlights appeared warm golden squares against the darkness. "Sullivan Ranch," Garrett announced, relief evident in his voice. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out the shapes of buildings: a large main house built of logs, a barn, several outbuildings, all nestled against a backdrop of pine trees that provided some shelter from the wind. The wagon pulled up to the main house, and almost immediately the door opened, spilling light and warmth onto the snow-covered yard. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, her hands on her hips. "Garrett Sullivan," she called out, her voice carrying even over the storm. "What in heaven's name are you doing out in this weather with those children?" "No choice, Mrs. Mitchell," he replied, setting the brake on the wagon. "The stage was delayed, and then the storm hit before we could start back." He jumped down from the wagon and lifted the still-sleeping twins into his arms with practiced ease. "We have a guest," he added, nodding toward Eleanor. "Miss Sinclair will be staying with us for a time." Mrs. Mitchell stepped forward, her face coming into the light. A woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp, assessing eyes that took in Eleanor's bedraggled appearance with obvious suspicion. A guest? In this weather? In a wedding dress? Her tone made it clear she found the situation highly irregular. "It's a long story," Mr. Sullivan said, his voice taking on an edge of authority. "One that can wait until we're all inside and warm. Miss Sinclair will be taking the position of governess for the girls." He carried the twins toward the house, leaving Eleanor to follow with as much dignity as she could muster in her frozen state. Mrs. Mitchell's disapproving gaze raked over her once more, before the older woman stepped aside to let her pass. The interior of the Sullivan home was a revelation after the bitter cold outside. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its flames casting dancing shadows on log walls hung with quilts and simple frontier artwork. Solid wooden furniture, a long dining table, several chairs a sideboard spoke of comfort rather than luxury, though Eleanor noted a few touches that suggested feminine influence. A vase of dried wildflowers, carefully embroidered cushions, a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes. Mr. Sullivan had disappeared, presumably to put the twins to bed. Mrs. Mitchell stood by the fire, her arms crossed over her chest, watching Eleanor with undisguised skepticism. "So," the older woman said finally, "you're to be the new governess." Eleanor summoned what remained of her strength and met the housekeeper's gaze directly. "Mr. Sullivan has offered me the position on a trial basis. 2 weeks to determine if the arrangement suits both parties." Mrs. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "And how exactly did he come to offer you this position? At this hour, in this weather, with you dressed like that?" The implication was clear, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, despite her exhaustion. "We met at the station in Cheyenne," she replied stiffly. "My circumstances had changed unexpectedly, and I found myself in need of accommodation. Mr. Sullivan kindly offered employment and shelter when he learned I had teaching experience." "I see." The older woman's tone suggested she saw rather more than Eleanor had said. "And what brings a Boston lady? Yes, I can hear it in your voice, all the way to Wyoming territory in a wedding dress." Before Eleanor could formulate a response that maintained both truth and dignity, Garrett Sullivan returned to the room. "That's enough, Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly but firmly. "Miss Sinclair has had a trying day and deserves rest, not interrogation. Is the blue room prepared?" Mrs. Mitchell's lips thinned, but she nodded. "Always kept ready, as you know." "Good. Please show Miss Sinclair upstairs. We can discuss arrangements in the morning when everyone has rested." He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening slightly. "Your trunk is still in the wagon. I'll bring it in once I've seen to the horses." "Thank you," Eleanor managed, fighting to keep her eyes open. The warmth of the house after the prolonged cold was making her dangerously drowsy. Mrs. Mitchell gestured toward a staircase at the far end of the room. "This way," she said, her tone marginally less hostile. "You look dead on your feet, girl." Eleanor followed her up the stairs, each step an effort. The upper floor held a central hallway with several doors leading off it. Mrs. Mitchell opened one, revealing a modest but clean bedroom with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small chest of drawers, and a chair by the window. "Bathrooms down the hall," the housekeeper said. "I'll bring hot water for washing and a nightgown. Can't have you sleeping in that." She nodded at the ruined wedding dress. "Thank you," Eleanor said sincerely. "I appreciate your kindness." Something flickered in the older woman's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at being thanked. "It's my job," she said gruffly. "Been caring for this household since before the twins were born." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You should know," she said, her back to Eleanor. "Those little girls have been through enough. They don't need more disruption in their lives." Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Mitchell was gone, closing the door firmly behind her. Left alone, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day crashing over her like waves. In the space of 24 hours, she had lost her fiancé, her future, and nearly her life to the bitter Wyoming winter. And now she found herself in a stranger's home, preparing to teach two motherless girls she had just met. What madness had brought her to this pass? And yet, what choice did she have? Mrs. Mitchell returned with hot water, a flannel nightgown, and a cup of steaming tea laced with honey. She helped Eleanor out of the ruined wedding dress without comment, though her eyes lingered on the fine silk and lace now stained and torn beyond repair. Once clean, warm, and changed, Eleanor barely managed to thank the housekeeper before sleep claimed her. Her last conscious thought was of blue eyes, the twins so bright and hopeful, and their fathers deep and shadowed, with secrets she couldn't begin to fathom. Morning arrived with a clarity that seemed impossible after the previous night's storm. Sunlight streamed through the window of Eleanor's room, reflecting off the pristine snow that blanketed the landscape as far as the eye could see. For a moment, she lay disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-muddled mind. Then, memory returned the telegram, the station, the Sullivan family. She sat up wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. The journey through the blizzard had taken its toll, leaving her muscles aching and her hands and feet still tender from the cold. Yet she was alive, and for the moment safe. A soft knock at the door preceded Mrs. Mitchell's entrance. The housekeeper carried a tray with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of biscuits. Her expression remained reserved, but some of the previous night's hostility had faded. "Good morning," she said, placing the tray on the small table by the window. "Mr. Sullivan thought you might appreciate breakfast in your room this first day. The girls are already up and asking about you." Eleanor glanced at the small clock on the dresser. It was nearly 9, far later than she usually rose. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. I didn't intend to sleep so late." The older woman sniffed. "After what you went through yesterday, it's a wonder you're awake at all. I've laid out some clothes for you there." She nodded toward the chair where a simple dark blue dress and white shirtwaist had been placed. "They were Rebecca's, Mrs. Sullivan's. You look to be about her size." Eleanor hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of wearing a dead woman's clothing. "I wouldn't want to presume Mr. Sullivan suggested it," Mrs. Mitchell interrupted. "Said your trunk might not have suitable clothes for ranch life. These are practical, not fancy, like that wedding dress." Her tone softened slightly. "They've just been gathering dust. Might as well be used." The practicality of the suggestion overcame Eleanor's reservations. Her trunk contained city clothes, fashionable but utterly impractical for the frontier. "Thank you," she said. "Please tell Mr. Sullivan I appreciate his thoughtfulness." Mrs. Mitchell nodded and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "Breakfast for the family is at 7 sharp. Dinner at noon, supper at 6. Mr. Sullivan keeps regular hours and expects the same of the household." "I understand. It won't happen again." Something that might have been approval flickered in the housekeeper's eyes before she departed, closing the door behind her. Eleanor dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes, surprised at how well they fit. The dark blue wool skirt and crisp white shirtwaist were of good quality, but designed for movement and work, not show. She twisted her long brown hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck and regarded herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the hopeful bride who had boarded the train in Boston a week ago. This woman's face was paler, her green eyes shadowed with experience, her mouth set in a firmer line. Eleanor squared her shoulders. Whatever came next, she would face it with dignity and purpose. It was the only way she knew. Downstairs she found the main room empty, save for Mr. Sullivan, who stood by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. He turned at her approach, and for a moment, surprise registered on his face, whether at her appearance or at seeing her in his late wife's clothes, Eleanor couldn't tell. "Good morning, Miss St. Clair," he said, recovering quickly. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you." She clasped her hands before her, suddenly uncertain. In the light of day, their arrangement seemed even more irregular than it had in the desperate circumstances of the previous night. "Mr. Sullivan, about our agreement. The girls are in the kitchen, with Mrs. Mitchell," he interrupted, setting down his coffee cup. "They're eager to begin their lessons. I've set up the small parlor as a schoolroom of sorts. It's not much, but there's a blackboard and some books." He led her through a doorway off the main room into a smaller space that had indeed been arranged as a schoolroom. A blackboard stood on an easel in one corner, a small table with 4 chairs occupied the center, and a bookshelf held a modest but respectable collection of books, readers, primers, a geography text, and several volumes of children's literature. "It's perfect," Eleanor said, genuinely impressed by the effort. You seem well prepared for a governess." A shadow crossed his face. "Rebecca, my wife. She always wanted the girls to have a proper education. After she died, I tried to continue their lessons, but—" he gestured vaguely. "The ranch demands much of my time, and I'm not a trained teacher." "I understand. What have they learned so far?" "They know their letters and can count to 20. They've memorized a few Bible verses. Charlotte has begun to read simple words, but Clara prefers to have stories read to her." Eleanor nodded mentally, cataloging this information. "And what are your expectations for their education?" Mr. Sullivan considered the question seriously. "I want them to have options," he said finally. "To be able to choose their paths in life, not be limited by lack of schooling." "That's a progressive view," Eleanor observed. "Many fathers, especially out here, might not prioritize education for daughters." A faint smile touched his lips. "Rebecca would haunt me if I didn't. She read everything she could get her hands on, ordered books from as far away as Chicago. She always said knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you." The door burst open before Eleanor could respond, and the twins tumbled into the room, followed by a resigned-looking Mrs. Mitchell. "Like trying to hold back a flash flood," the housekeeper muttered, but there was fondness beneath her gruff tone. "Miss Eleanor, you're awake." Clara, identified by her immediate speech and lack of the freckle her father had mentioned, rushed forward. "Are we going to have lessons now, Papa said you're a teacher?" Charlotte approached more cautiously, studying Eleanor with solemn blue eyes. "Do we have to learn arithmetic?" she asked finally. "I don't like numbers. They're slippery." Eleanor couldn't help but smile. "Yes, we'll have arithmetic, but I promise to make it as interesting as possible. Numbers aren't so slippery once you get to know them better." She looked up to find Garrett Sullivan watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. "I'll leave you to it then," he said. "I have work in the barn. The storm has put us behind." "Of course." Eleanor turned her attention to the twins, who were now examining the schoolroom with renewed interest. "Shall we begin with reading? I'd like to see how much you both know." The morning passed in a whirl of assessment and improvisation. Eleanor quickly discovered that while the twins were bright, their education had indeed been inconsistent. Charlotte read haltingly, but with comprehension, while Clara could recite the alphabet perfectly, but struggled to connect letters to sounds. Both girls knew basic addition and subtraction, but became confused with numbers above 10. Most tellingly, their attention spans were brief, their bodies accustomed to the freedom of play rather than the discipline of study. By mid-morning, Eleanor realized a change of approach was needed. "Let's try something different," she said, closing the primer they had been struggling through. "How about we combine our lessons with movement?" She led them to an open space in the room and arranged them in a line. "Now we're going to hop forward while counting. 1 hop, 1 number. Ready." The girls' faces lit up, and soon they were hopping and counting, giggling when they reached numbers that had previously confused them. Eleanor followed with letter sounds, having them make different movements for different phonetic combinations. So engrossed were they in this new form of learning that none of them noticed Garrett Sullivan standing in the doorway, watching with an expression of mingled surprise and appreciation. "Ahem." He cleared his throat eventually. "It seems lessons are going well." Eleanor turned momentarily embarrassed to be caught hopping around the schoolroom. "Mr. Sullivan." "Yes, we're trying a different approach. Children often learn better when their bodies are engaged along with their minds." "Papa," Clara ran to him, "Miss Eleanor is teaching us to count with our feet. I can go all the way to 20 now without getting mixed up." "Impressive," he said, a genuine smile warming his features. And what about you, Charlotte? What have you learned? Letters make different sounds when they're together than when they're alone, Charlotte replied seriously. Like people. Something flickered in Garrett's eyes at his daughter's observation. That's very insightful, Charlotte. He looked at Eleanor. I came to let you know dinner will be ready soon. Mrs. Mitchell suggested you might like to show the girls how to wash up properly beforehand. Apparently, their usual method leaves much to be desired. But of course, Eleanor agreed. Girls, let's go prepare for dinner. We can continue our lessons afterward. As they filed out of the schoolroom, Eleanor noticed a book lying on a side table that hadn't been there before, a leather-bound volume with gold lettering on the spine, Collected Poetry of Lord Byron. Curious, she picked it up and found a pressed flower marking a page, a faded wildflower, its color long gone, but its delicate shape preserved between the leaves. The poem it marked was, She Walks in Beauty, and in the margin, written in a fine feminine hand, were the words, To remember this day always are. That was Rebecca's. Eleanor started nearly dropping the book. Garrett stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, she said quickly, replacing the volume. I didn't mean to pry. It's all right, he said, though his voice had tightened. Rebecca loved poetry, Byron especially. He hesitated, then added, You should feel free to use any of the books here for the girls' education. Rebecca would have wanted that. He turned to leave, then paused. You're good with them, better than I expected. They respond to you. The simple compliment warmed Eleanor more than it should have. They're wonderful children, Mr. Sullivan. Bright and curious. It's a joy to teach them. Something in his face softened minutely. Thank you for saying so. Not everyone sees past their exuberance. After dinner, while the girls napped, a routine Mrs. Mitchell insisted upon, despite their protests, Eleanor found herself drawn back to the bookshelf in the schoolroom. Beyond the educational texts, there was a collection of literature that spoke of a cultivated mind, Shakespeare, Austen, Dickens, alongside American writers like Emerson and Thoreau. As she examined the volumes, a small leather-bound book caught her eye. Unlike the others, it had no title on its spine. Curious, she pulled it out and opened it to find handwritten pages, a journal, its entries dated from 4 years earlier. Eleanor knew she should close it immediately. Reading another's private thoughts was unconscionable. Yet as she moved to return it to the shelf, a sentence caught her eye. Dr. Morgan confirmed my fears today. The consumption has returned worse than before. Her heart pounding, Eleanor glanced toward the door to ensure she was still alone, then turned the page. I haven't told Garrett yet. How can I? He's so happy about the new cattle, about expanding the ranch. And the girls, my precious girls. They're too young to understand, too young to remember me if the worst happens. I can't bear the thought of leaving them, of leaving him. But the doctor says a year at most if I'm fortunate. A year to create enough memories to last lifetimes. Eleanor closed the journal, her hands trembling. Rebecca Sullivan had known she was dying, had kept that knowledge to herself to spare her family pain. The revelation cast everything in a new light. Garrett's grief, the twins' need for stability, even Mrs. Mitchell's protective hostility. As she carefully returned the journal to its place, Eleanor caught sight of a piece of paper that had slipped from between its pages. It was a letter unfinished, written in the same delicate hand as the journal. My dearest girls, it began. By the time you're old enough to read this, I will have been gone for some time. But know that I am watching over you always, my darling Clara and Charlotte. I've asked the angels to send someone special to care for you when I no longer can, someone with a kind heart and a patient soul who will love you as I do. The letter ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted, or perhaps had found herself unable to continue. Eleanor replaced it carefully within the journal, her throat tight with emotion. She had intruded on the most private of griefs, and yet the discovery gave her a deeper understanding of the family she had so unexpectedly joined. Rebecca Sullivan had been loved deeply and completely. Her absence had left a void that Eleanor would never presume to fill. Yet perhaps, in some small way, she could help ease the burden her passing had left on those who remained. With that thought firmly in mind, Eleanor returned to her charges, determined to honor the legacy of the remarkable woman whose home she now shared. The next few days fell into a rhythm as Eleanor adjusted to life at Sullivan Ranch. Mornings were devoted to lessons with the twins, afternoons to what she termed practical studies, educational activities tied to ranch life. They counted eggs in the hen house, measured ingredients for Mrs. Mitchell's baking, and identified plants in the kitchen garden that had been buried under snow but was now beginning to emerge as the weather improved. The girls thrived under this approach, their natural intelligence flourishing when given direction and purpose. Eleanor found herself enjoying teaching more than she had in Boston, where strict curriculum requirements had limited her creativity. Garrett Sullivan observed these developments with evident approval, often joining them for their afternoon activities when ranch work permitted. Eleanor noticed he made a point of being present at every meal, no matter how busy the day, a commitment to his daughters that spoke volumes about his character. As for Mrs. Mitchell, her initial hostility had gradually given way to a grudging respect. She still watched Eleanor with sharp eyes, but occasionally offered suggestions for working with the twins or explained ranch customs that might be unfamiliar to a city woman. 4 days after her arrival, Eleanor decided it was time for the girls to experience more of the outdoors, now that the snow was beginning to melt. After obtaining Garrett's permission, she bundled Clara and Charlotte in warm coats and took them for a walk around the immediate vicinity of the ranch house. "Can we show Miss Eleanor the creek?" Clara asked, bouncing with excitement. "It might have frogs soon." "Not yet," Eleanor replied, smiling at the child's enthusiasm. "It's still too cold for frogs, but we can certainly look at the creek." They followed a well-worn path that wound behind the barn and through a stand of cottonwood trees. The creek was small but swift, its waters clear and cold, edged with the last remnants of winter ice. "Papa says this creek saved the ranch during the big drought," Charlotte informed Eleanor solemnly. "All the other creeks dried up, but this one comes from deep in the mountains, where there's always snow. That's why our cows are the fattest," Clara added proudly. "They always have water to drink even in summer." Eleanor was impressed by their knowledge. "Your father has taught you well about the ranch." "Mama taught us too," Charlotte said, "before she got sick." Clara's face clouded at the mention of their mother. "I don't remember Mama teaching us. I just remember her in bed." Charlotte took her sister's hand. "You were too little, but I remember. She showed us how the wildflowers have different names and which berries we can eat." Eleanor's heart ached for the children, one with memories that were fading, one with memories perhaps too painful to recall. "Your mother sounds like a wonderful teacher," she said gently. "I'm sure she'd be very proud of how much you're learning now." The moment was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats. All three turned to see a rider approaching along the creek bank, a man in his late 30s or early 40s, well-dressed in a manner that seemed out of place on the frontier. He rode a magnificent black stallion, his seat easy and confident. "Well, well," he called as he drew near, "what have we here? The Sullivan twins and a new face." His gaze fixed on Eleanor, assessing and somehow proprietary in a way that made her instinctively draw the girls closer to her sides. "Good afternoon, sir," she replied with cool courtesy. I'm Miss Sinclair, governess to the Sullivan children. Victor Reynolds, he introduced himself with a tip of his hat. Owner of the neighboring Rocking R Ranch, and I must say a pleasant surprise to find someone of obvious refinement in these parts. His smile did not reach his eyes, which remained calculating as they moved from Eleanor to the twins and back again. Clara stuck out her tongue, an action Eleanor would normally have corrected immediately. However, something about Mr. Reynolds made her hesitate to reprimand the child in his presence. Now, Clara, Reynolds said, his tone falsely jovial, is that any way to greet a neighbor? What would your dear mother say? Charlotte's small hand tightened in Eleanor's. Our mama said you're a snake in fancy boots, she said quietly but distinctly. Reynolds's face darkened momentarily before he forced a laugh. Children's imagination. Rebecca always did have a colorful way with words. He returned his attention to Eleanor. You must find it quite a change, Miss Sinclair, coming from civilization to this wilderness. I find it refreshing, Eleanor replied, her instinctive dislike of the man growing by the moment. The Sullivan Ranch is a wonderful place for children to grow and learn. Indeed, well, should you find yourself in need of more sophisticated company, the Rocking R is always open to visitors. I have quite an extensive library that might interest an educated woman such as yourself. Before Eleanor could formulate a polite refusal, another horse and rider appeared, Garrett Sullivan, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene. Reynolds, he acknowledged tersely. You're a long way from your property. Or just taking a ride, Sullivan, getting to know your new employee. The slight pause before the last word carried insinuations that made Eleanor's cheeks burn with indignation. Garrett dismounted in one fluid motion and strode to stand beside Eleanor and the twins. Miss Sinclair is governess to my daughters, and deserves the same respect you'd show any lady. Reynolds smiled thinly. Of course, no offense intended. He looked back at Eleanor. My invitation stands, Miss Sinclair. The Rocking R is known for its hospitality. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds, but my duties keep me fully occupied here, Eleanor replied firmly. With a final nod that managed to be both mocking and threatening, Reynolds turned his horse and rode away along the creek bank. As soon as he was out of earshot, Garrett turned to Eleanor. Are you all right? Did he say anything inappropriate? Nothing overtly so, she assured him, touched by his concern. Though his manner was rather presumptuous. Garrett's jaw tightened. Victor Reynolds has presumed much over the years. He knelt to the twins' level. Girls, go back to the house and tell Mrs. Mitchell I said to give you some cookies. Miss Sinclair and I need to talk. After the children had scampered off, Garrett led Eleanor to a fallen log by the creek bank. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the water flow past. Reynolds has been trying to buy this land for years, Garrett said finally, particularly this section with the creek. His property adjoins ours to the north, but his water access is limited. In a dry year, that can mean the difference between profit and ruin out here. I gathered there was some history between you, Eleanor said carefully. Garrett's laugh held no humor. History? Yes, you could say that. He picked up a stone and tossed it into the creek, watching the ripples spread. Victor Reynolds courted Rebecca before I did. When she chose me, a rancher, with modest holdings over the wealthy son of a Denver banker, he took it as a personal affront. I see, Eleanor said, understanding dawning. And now he wants your land. Not just the land. Garrett's voice was low, intense. He wants to see me fail, to prove Rebecca made the wrong choice. He turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. Miss Sinclair, Eleanor, I need to ask you to be careful around Reynolds. He's a dangerous man, not because he's violent, but because he's patient and calculating. He plays a long game. The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through Eleanor, despite the gravity of the conversation. "I understand," she assured him. "I felt uneasy in his presence." "Good instincts," Garrett nodded. "I should have warned you about him earlier, but I hadn't expected him to approach you and the girls directly. It's not his usual method." "What is his usual method?" Garrett's expression darkened. "Undercutting my cattle prices with Eastern buyers, spreading rumors about the quality of Sullivan beef, hiring away my best hands with offers they can't refuse." He sighed. After Rebecca died, he waited a decent interval, then offered to buy the ranch at half its value for the girls' sake, he claimed, so they wouldn't have to grow up with just a father. The cruelty of such an offer made to a grieving widower stunned Eleanor. "That's despicable." "That's Victor Reynolds." Garrett stood offering his hand to help Eleanor up. "I don't mean to burden you with ranch business, but you should know who you're dealing with. Reynolds isn't just a nosy neighbor. He's a man with a grudge and the means to act on it." As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor found herself studying Garrett Sullivan with new eyes. The quiet strength she had observed before now seemed more poignant, knowing the pressures he faced. Running a ranch alone was challenge enough. Doing so while raising two young daughters and fending off a vindictive rival spoke to a resilience of character she couldn't help but admire. "Mr. Sullivan," she said as they neared the house, "thank you for being candid with me. I appreciate knowing the complexities of the situation here." He glanced down at her, a hint of his rare smile lightening his features. "I think, given the circumstances, you might call me Garrett. At least when the girls aren't present. Mr. Sullivan makes me feel like my father." Eleanor found herself returning his smile. "Very well, Garrett, and you may call me Eleanor if you wish." As they reached the porch, Mrs. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, her expression even more pinched than usual. "You had a visitor while you were out," she announced without preamble. "Victor Reynolds' man delivered this." She thrust an envelope toward Garrett, who opened it with a frown. His face darkened as he read the contents. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, concerned by his expression. "An invitation," he replied, his voice tight, "to a social gathering at the Rocking R next Saturday, for the pleasure of the company of Mr. Garrett Sullivan, his daughters, and their governess, Miss Eleanor Sinclair." Mrs. Mitchell sniffed disapprovingly. "Mighty presumptuous, including Miss Sinclair by name when he's only just met her." "Indeed," Garrett agreed, his jaw tight. "Reynolds works fast when he sees something or someone he wants." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late winter air. The thought of being an object of interest to Victor Reynolds was deeply unsettling. "We don't have to accept," she began, but Garrett shook his head. "Unfortunately, we do. Reynolds is hosting the county's most influential ranchers and businessmen. Declining would be seen as an insult, and would give him more ammunition for his rumors about Sullivan Ranch failing." He looked at Eleanor apologetically. "I won't insist you accompany us if it makes you uncomfortable. I can make your excuses." Eleanor considered the offer. The prospect of facing Victor Reynolds again was unappealing, yet the thought of Garrett having to navigate the event alone with two young children was worse. "No," she decided firmly. "I'll go. The girls will need supervision, and—" She hesitated, then added, "and I won't give Mr. Reynolds the satisfaction of thinking he's frightened me away." Something like pride flickered in Garrett's eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. As Eleanor followed Mrs. Mitchell inside to help prepare supper, she realized that in less than a week, her priorities had shifted dramatically. The pain of Thomas's betrayal, while still present, had receded in the face of new concerns, the twins' education, Garrett's struggles to maintain the ranch, and now the threat posed by Victor Reynolds. She had come west seeking a husband and security. Instead, she found herself embroiled in a feud between neighboring ranchers responsible for two motherless girls, and increasingly drawn to a man whose heart still clearly belonged to his late wife. What strange turns life could take, Eleanor reflected as she helped set the table, and how utterly unprepared she had been for this particular turn. Yet for the first time since receiving Thomas's telegram, she felt a sense of purpose, and perhaps, though she scarcely dared acknowledge it, the faintest stirring of belonging. The night air was crisp and cool as Eleanor sat on the porch swing, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. The moon hung full and bright in the sky, casting the ranch in silver light that transformed the everyday into something magical. In the week since her arrival, she had discovered that these quiet moments after the twins were asleep and the day's work done were precious, a time to reflect and gather her thoughts. Inside, she could hear Garrett moving about, checking doors and windows before retiring, a routine she had come to recognize. The steady, methodical sounds were oddly comforting, a reminder that despite the isolation of the ranch, she was not alone. The screen door creaked, and Garrett stepped onto the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand. He hesitated when he saw her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to intrude on your solitude." "You're not intruding," Eleanor assured him. "It's your porch, after all." A faint smile touched his lips as he moved to lean against the porch railing facing her. "True, but everyone deserves moments of peace. God knows they're rare enough on a ranch." They fell into a companionable silence, Eleanor gently pushing the swing with her foot, Garrett sipping his coffee as he gazed out at the moonlit landscape. There was an ease between them that had developed gradually over the past week, a comfort in each other's presence that required no words. "The girls did well in their arithmetic today," Eleanor said eventually. "Charlotte especially seems to have overcome her fear of numbers." Garrett nodded, pride evident in his expression. "I noticed. She was counting the new calves for me this afternoon without getting confused once. They're remarkably bright children. You and Rebecca must have read to them from an early age." At the mention of his late wife, Garrett's face took on the distant look that always accompanied her name. But tonight, rather than changing the subject as he usually did, he surprised Eleanor by responding directly. "Rebecca read to them before they were born," he said softly. "Used to say they needed to know the sound of words even before they understood their meaning." His gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon. "She had plans for them, college back east someday, maybe even Europe. Said they should see more of the world than just Wyoming territory." Eleanor heard the wistfulness in his voice, the lingering grief. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was." Garrett turned to look at Eleanor directly. "I found Rebecca's journal in the schoolroom yesterday. It had been moved." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. "I came across it while looking for books for the girls. I opened it before realizing what it was, and then—" She trailed off, unable to justify her invasion of privacy. To her surprise, Garrett didn't seem angry. "It's all right," he said. "I should have warned you it was there. Rebecca kept journals throughout our marriage. That one—" He hesitated. "That was her last." Eleanor nodded, unsure what to say. "I only read a page," she admitted. "But it was enough to understand that she knew she was ill long before—" "Before she told me." Garrett's voice was tight with old pain. "Yes, Dr. Morgan confirmed it later. She'd been diagnosed months before she finally admitted it to me." "She wanted to spare you," Eleanor said gently. "From what little I read, It was clear how much she loved you and the girls. Garrett set his coffee mug on the porch railing and ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture Eleanor had come to recognize as a sign of emotional struggle. "I could have done more," he said, finally, the words seeming to burst from some long-sealed place. "If I'd known earlier, I could have taken her to specialists in Denver or even back east. There might have been treatments." "She made her choice," Eleanor interrupted softly. "To spend her remaining time here with you and the girls, rather than in hospital rooms with doctors who might or might not have helped." Garrett looked at her sharply. "How can you know that?" "Because it's what I would have done," Eleanor replied simply. Faced with the same choice time with loved ones or a slim chance at more years among strangers, I believe many would choose as Rebecca did. He studied her face for a long moment, as if seeing her anew. "You're an unusual woman, Eleanor Sinclair," he said finally. "Most would condemn Rebecca for keeping such a secret from her husband." "I'm not most people," Eleanor said, "and I don't presume to judge others' choices, especially in matters of the heart." Before Garrett could respond, a cry shattered the night's stillness, a child's voice high and frightened. Without hesitation, both adults rushed into the house and up the stairs to the twins' bedroom. Charlotte sat upright in bed, tears streaming down her face, while Clara watched helplessly from her own bed across the room. "She had the dream again," Clara explained, her voice small with worry. "About Mama and the snow." Garrett crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered Charlotte into his arms. "It's all right, sweetheart," he murmured, rocking her gently. "You're safe. Papa's here." Eleanor moved to Clara's side, instinctively offering comfort to the twin who, though not experiencing the nightmare directly, was clearly distressed by her sister's fear. "What happens in the dream?" she asked quietly, smoothing Clara's tangled copper curls. Clara's blue eyes, so like her father's, fixed on Eleanor's face. "Charlotte dreams that Mama is lost in the snow, and we can't find her. She keeps calling for us, but her voice gets farther and farther away until we can't hear her anymore." The simple description sent a chill through Eleanor. She glanced across the room where Charlotte's sobs had quieted to hiccuping breaths against her father's shoulder. "Miss Eleanor," Charlotte's tremulous voice called. She extended one small hand toward Eleanor, who moved to the bedside without hesitation. "I'm here, Charlotte," she said, taking the child's outstretched hand. "Will you stay too?" Charlotte asked, her eyes still bright with tears. "Sometimes the dream comes back." Eleanor glanced at Garrett, who nodded his permission. She sat on the edge of the bed, still holding Charlotte's hand. "Of course I'll stay." Clara slipped from her own bed and climbed onto her father's lap, completing the circle. The 4 of them remained that way. In the moonlit bedroom, Garrett, with one daughter in his arms, Eleanor holding the other's hand, a tableau of comfort and connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. As the twins drifted back to sleep, Eleanor found herself studying Garrett's face in the silvery light. The lines of worry had softened, replaced by an expression of such tender love for his daughters that it made her heart ache. This was a side of him few probably ever saw, the fierce protector giving way to the gentle father. When both girls were sleeping soundly, Garrett carefully laid Charlotte back on her bed and covered her with the quilt. Eleanor released the small hand she had been holding and rose to follow him from the room. In the hallway outside the twins' room, Garrett paused. "Thank you," he said simply. "There's no need to thank me," Eleanor replied. "Any decent person would offer comfort to a frightened child." "Not everyone would," he countered. "Mrs. Mitchell tries, but she finds it difficult. She was Rebecca's aunt, did you know? Her grief is still raw." The information explained much about the housekeeper's initial hostility. "I didn't realize," Eleanor said, That explains her protectiveness toward you and the girls. Garrett nodded. She promised Rebecca she'd look after us. She takes that promise very seriously. He hesitated, then added, "The nightmares have been less frequent lately, but when they come, it's natural," Eleanor assured him. Grief takes time, especially for children. They process it differently than adults often through dreams and play. You sound knowledgeable on the subject. Eleanor thought of her own childhood grief, the nightmares that had plagued her after her parents' deaths. "I was 7 when my parents died of typhoid," she said quietly. "Old enough to understand what had happened, but not why. The sisters at the orphanage were kind, but they had many children to care for. Nightmares were common." Something shifted in Garrett's expression, a new understanding, perhaps, of what shaped the woman before him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know." "How could you? We're still virtual strangers, despite living under the same roof." "Are we?" he asked, his voice low. "Strangers don't comfort each other's children in the night. They don't share confidences on moonlit porches." The intensity of his gaze made Eleanor's heart beat faster. "Perhaps not," she conceded. "But a week is a very short time to know someone. Some people reveal their true character quickly in challenging circumstances," Garrett said. "You've shown yours from the moment we met, your courage in the face of abandonment, your kindness to my daughters, your willingness to adapt to a life vastly different from what you expected." Eleanor was grateful for the dimness of the hallway, which hid the blush she felt rising to her cheeks. "You give me too much credit," she demurred. "I've merely done what was necessary under the circumstances." "And that," Garrett said softly, "is precisely what reveals character, what one does when necessity demands action." He stepped back slightly, as if suddenly aware of their proximity in the narrow hallway. "It's late. You should rest." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, though rest seemed unlikely with her pulse still racing from their exchange. "Good night, Garrett." "Oh, good night, Eleanor," he replied, the use of her given name somehow more intimate in the darkness of the sleeping house. As she returned to her room, Eleanor found herself dwelling not on Thomas's betrayal or her uncertain future, but on the family whose lives had so unexpectedly entwined with hers, the twins with their bright minds and wounded hearts, Mrs. Mitchell with her gruff loyalty to her dead niece's memory, and Garrett Sullivan, a man carrying the weight of a ranch, 2 children, and a grief he had never fully expressed. She had come west seeking security, and found instead a household of broken hearts trying to mend themselves. And somehow, against all reason, she was beginning to feel that perhaps she belonged among them not as a replacement for what they had lost, but as something new and different. Something that might in time help heal the wounds that still bled beneath the surface of daily life at Sullivan Ranch. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor's last conscious thought was of 4 people connected in a circle of comfort in a moonlit room. For the first time since receiving Thomas's telegram, she felt no regret for the path not taken. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was exactly where she needed to be. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the schoolroom, painting golden patterns across the worn wooden floor. Eleanor watched as Charlotte carefully formed letters on her slate, her small face a study in concentration. Across the table, Clara was attempting to copy a simple map of Wyoming territory, her tongue caught between her teeth as she worked. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor's arrival at Sullivan Ranch. 2 weeks that had transformed her from a desperate stranger into a valued member of the household. The trial period she and Garrett had agreed upon was ending today, though neither had mentioned it. Perhaps Eleanor thought they both understood that some arrangements needed no formal extension. "Miss Eleanor," Charlotte's voice broke into her thoughts, "is this correct? Eleanor examined the child's neat handwriting, a marked improvement from the uncertain scrawl of just days ago. Perfect, Charlotte. Your penmanship is coming along beautifully. Clara looked up from her map. What about mine? Miss Eleanor, I drew the mountains where Papa says our ranch is. Eleanor moved to the girl's side, noting the enthusiastic, if not entirely accurate, representation of the Sullivan property. Very creative, Clara. Tomorrow we'll work more on scale and proportion, but you've captured the important landmarks. As the girls returned to their work, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, where she could see Garrett in the distance riding alongside one of his ranch hands as they checked the new calves. Even from afar, his straight-backed figure was unmistakable, his movements confident and assured as he guided his horse through the herd. In the short time she had known him, Eleanor had come to respect Garrett Sullivan deeply. He was a man of few words, but consistent actions devoted to his daughters, fair with his workers, and unfailingly courteous to her. If sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, or if their hands occasionally touched when passing items at the dinner table, she attributed it to the natural intimacy that developed between people sharing a home and responsibilities. "Can we have our reading lesson outside today?" Clara asked, interrupting Eleanor's thoughts. "It's so pretty, and the snow is almost all gone." "That's an excellent suggestion," Eleanor agreed, grateful for the distraction from her increasingly personal musings. "Let's finish our current work, and then we can take our books to the garden." As the girls gathered their materials and a knock at the door announced Mrs. Mitchell's presence. The housekeeper had warmed considerably toward Eleanor over the past fortnight, though she maintained a certain reserve that Eleanor suspected was simply part of her nature. "Mail's arrived," Mrs. Mitchell announced, holding out several envelopes. "There's one for you, Miss Sinclair." Eleanor accepted the letter with surprise. Few people knew her whereabouts, and she had not expected correspondence. The return address showed it was from her former colleague at Miss Harrington's school in Boston. Curiosity piqued, she set it aside for later reading. "Also," Mrs. Mitchell continued, "I'm setting the girls' room to rights today. Found this under Charlotte's pillow." She held out a small, worn photograph. "Thought you should know. The child's been hiding it." Eleanor glanced at the twins, now engrossed in organizing their books, then took the photograph. It showed a young woman with copper-red hair and a radiant smile holding two infant girls in her arms. Rebecca Sullivan, in one of her last healthy moments. "She takes it out at night," Mrs. Mitchell said quietly. "Talks to it sometimes. I've heard her when I pass the room." Eleanor's heart constricted. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'll return it to her pillow. I think it comforts her." The housekeeper nodded, her usually stern expression softening. "Rebecca would be pleased, you know, with how you are with them." Before Eleanor could respond to this unexpected compliment, Mrs. Mitchell turned and left her back ramrod straight, as always. Later, after the morning lessons were complete, and the girls were occupied with Mrs. Mitchell preparing lunch, Eleanor retreated to the schoolroom to read her letter. Her colleague's news from Boston seemed to come from another world entirely: school board politics, social engagements, and city gossip that no longer held any relevance to her daily life. One paragraph, however, caught her attention. "Your former fiancé, Mr. Blackwell, has been the subject of much discussion in certain circles. It seems his banking venture in Wyoming territory has encountered difficulties. Rumors suggest financial improprieties, though nothing has been proven. Some say his sudden cancellation of your engagement may have been related to these troubles. I tell you this not to reopen wounds, my dear, but in case it offers some comfort to know his rejection likely had nothing to do with you personally." Eleanor sat back, absorbing this information. Thomas's financial troubles explained his cryptic telegram, Tai san da mut, kom konji de kung kup cho em. His fortune lost nothing left to offer her. As she pondered this revelation, her gaze fell on the bookshelf where she had found Rebecca's journal. Something compelled her to look again at the volumes there, seeking what? She wasn't certain. Among the books was a leather portfolio she hadn't noticed before. Curious, she lifted it down and opened it to find a collection of documents: property deeds, cattle sale records, bank correspondence. Clearly, this was where Garrett kept important ranch business papers. She should close it immediately and return it to its place. Yet as she moved to do so, a name on one of the documents caught her eye: Thomas Blackwell, Cheyenne Bank and Trust. Her heart pounding, Eleanor hesitated, then carefully extracted the paper. It was a loan agreement dated 2 years earlier, showing that Garrett Sullivan had borrowed a substantial sum from the bank where Thomas served as manager. The terms seemed unusually harsh: a high interest rate and a clause allowing the bank to claim Sullivan Ranch land if payments were missed. Tucked behind this document was a letter from Thomas to Garrett, dated 6 months ago. Mr. Sullivan, your request for an extension on your loan payment is denied. The terms were clearly outlined in our original agreement, and Cheyenne Bank and Trust must insist on strict adherence to the schedule. Should you fail to make the upcoming payment in full, we will be forced to exercise our right to claim the northern section of your property, including water rights to Sullivan Creek. I should add that Mr. Victor Reynolds has expressed interest in acquiring this portion of your ranch should it become available. As a courtesy, I am informing you of this interest in advance. Respectfully, Thomas Blackwell, Manager. Eleanor's hands trembled as she replaced the documents in the portfolio. Thomas and Victor Reynolds were connected. The man who had abandoned her at the altar was in business with the man threatening Garrett's livelihood. The implications were staggering. Had Thomas rejected her because he knew she was going to Sullivan Ranch? Or was it merely coincidence, his financial troubles forcing him to cancel their wedding, just as fate brought her to Garrett's door? Miss Eleanor, Clara's voice at the doorway, startled her so badly she nearly dropped the portfolio. Mrs. Mitchell says lunch is ready. Thank you, Clara. I'll be right there. Eleanor carefully returned the portfolio to its place on the shelf, her mind racing. Should she tell Garrett what she had discovered? The connection between Thomas and Reynolds might be crucial information. Yet, how could she explain finding it without admitting she had been looking through his private papers? Throughout lunch, Eleanor was uncharacteristically quiet, responding to the twins' chatter with absent smiles and brief answers. Garrett, observant as always, noticed her distraction, but said nothing until the girls had been excused to help Mrs. Mitchell with the dishes. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his blue eyes studying her face. "You seem troubled." Eleanor took a deep breath. Honesty had always been her policy, however uncomfortable. "I received a letter from Boston today," she began. "It contained information about my former fiancé that was surprising." "I see." Garrett's expression revealed nothing. "Bad news." "Not exactly. It seems Mr. Blackwell has encountered financial difficulties. His banking venture may be failing." She hesitated, then continued. "And I'm afraid I must confess something. While organizing books in the schoolroom, I came across your business portfolio. I didn't mean to pry, but I saw Thomas's name on a document, and I read it." Garrett's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "The loan agreement and his letter denying your extension request." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I had no idea my former fiancé was your banker, or that he was connected to Victor Reynolds." For a long moment, Garrett said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he sighed and ran a hand through his dark hair, that familiar gesture of frustration Eleanor had come to recognize. "I should have told you," he said finally, "when you first mentioned his name at the station. But I didn't want to add to your distress, and honestly, I didn't think the connection mattered. You were leaving him behind after all." "You knew—" Eleanor couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "You knew Thomas was my fiancé." Garrett nodded slowly. "Cheyenne isn't a large community, Eleanor. When you said your fiancé was Thomas Blackwell, I recognized the name immediately. He's been a challenging business associate." "Why didn't you say anything? What purpose would it have served? You were already dealing with his rejection. Learning he was also causing difficulties for your new employer would only have added to your burden." Eleanor considered this reasoning and found it both thoughtful and slightly paternalistic. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully, "but I prefer to know the truth, however uncomfortable, especially when it might affect my position here." Garrett looked genuinely confused. "How would it affect your position? If Thomas and Victor Reynolds are working together against you, my presence here might complicate matters. Thomas knows who I am, what I look like. If he learns I'm working for you—" "I fail to see how that changes anything," Garrett interrupted. "Unless—" his eyes narrowed slightly, "unless you're concerned about your former fiancé's opinion of your current situation." "No," Eleanor said quickly, stung by the implication. "I couldn't care less what Thomas thinks of me now, but I'm concerned about how my presence might affect your dealings with him and Reynolds." Garrett's expression softened. "I apologize. That was unfair of me." He leaned forward, his gaze intent. "Eleanor, your presence here has been nothing but beneficial to the girls, to the household, and—" he hesitated, then finished, "and to me. Whatever complications might arise from your connection to Blackwell, they're vastly outweighed by the good you've brought to Sullivan Ranch." The sincerity in his voice warmed Eleanor in a way she found both comforting and unsettling. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a great deal to me. Besides," Garrett continued, his tone lightening slightly, "your 2 weeks trial period ends today, and I had planned to ask you to stay on permanently, unless you've had second thoughts." "None whatsoever," Eleanor assured him, realizing as she spoke that it was entirely true. Despite the unexpected revelations and complications, Sullivan Ranch had begun to feel like home in a way Boston never had. Then it settled. Garrett rose from the table, signaling the end of their conversation. "We'll discuss salary and terms this evening after the girls are in bed." As he left the dining room, Eleanor remained seated, her thoughts in tumult. The connection between Thomas and Reynolds added a new dimension to her situation, one she couldn't fully comprehend yet. But Garrett's easy acceptance of her confession and his clear desire for her to remain at the ranch reassured her. Whatever happened next, she would face it with open eyes and the knowledge that she had found her place, however unexpectedly, in this remote corner of Wyoming territory. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as spring truly arrived at Sullivan Ranch. The last snow melted away, revealing tender green shoots in the pastures. Calving season reached its peak, with Garrett and his men working from dawn until well after dark to ensure the new additions to the herd arrived safely. Eleanor adjusted her teaching schedule to accommodate the twins' interest in the ranch operations, incorporating lessons about animal husbandry and botany into their daily studies. She found herself learning alongside the girls, fascinated by the intricate workings of the cattle operation that had previously been foreign to her. 4 days after her conversation with Garrett about Thomas Blackwell, disaster struck. Eleanor was in the midst of a reading lesson with the twins when they heard commotion outside, men shouting, horses galloping into the yard. Clara rushed to the window. "Something's wrong with Monarch," she reported, her voice rising with concern. "Papa's best bull." Eleanor and the girls hurried outside to find Garrett and two ranch hands attempting to contain a massive black bull that was clearly in distress, tossing its head and bellowing in pain. "Stay back," Garrett called when he spotted them. "He's unpredictable right now." They watched from a safe distance as the men managed to guide the animal into a small corral. Garrett examined the bull carefully, his experienced hands moving over the creature's heaving sides. "What's wrong with him, Papa?" Charlotte asked, her small face pinched with worry. Garrett approached them, wiping his hands on a bandana. "Monarch's sick," he explained, his expression grave. "I'm not sure what's ailing him, but we need Dr. Miller from town. He's the only veterinarian who might know." "Is Monarch going to die?" Clara's direct question hung in the air. Garrett knelt to his daughter's level, his tone gentle but honest. "I don't know, sweetheart. But Monarch is more than just a bull to us. He's the future of our herd. Without him—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Eleanor understood. The loss of a prize breeding bull could devastate a ranch's prospects. "I'll ride to Cheyenne immediately," one of the ranch hands offered. Garrett shook his head. "The river's running high with spring melt. The South Bridge is likely flooded. It would take you all day to go around." He stood, decision made. "I'll go myself. I know the shortcuts, and I can bring Dr. Miller back by nightfall if we hurry." Eleanor saw the concern flash across the twins' faces at the prospect of their father leaving even for a day. "We'll be fine here," she assured both them and Garrett. "The girls and I will continue our lessons and perhaps help Mrs. Mitchell bake bread this afternoon." Garrett nodded gratefully. "I shouldn't be gone more than a day, but if the river's worse than I expect, it might be tomorrow morning before we return." He turned to his foreman. "Jim, you're in charge until I get back. Keep an eye on Monarch and the new calves in the south pasture." Within half an hour, Garrett had saddled his fastest horse and prepared for the journey. Before departing, he took Eleanor aside, speaking in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the twins. "If I'm not back by tomorrow noon, send Jim to town. And Eleanor," he hesitated, "be watchful. With me gone, Reynolds might see an opportunity." "For what?" she asked, alarmed by his concern. "Anything. Cattle might accidentally break through fences onto his property. Ranch hands might be offered bribes. It wouldn't be the first time." His blue eyes held hers intently. "I trust you to protect what matters most." The weight of his words settled on her shoulders. He wasn't just asking her to mind the twins. He was entrusting her with the safety and integrity of everything he valued. "I understand," she said simply. With a final nod, Garrett mounted his horse. The twins ran to him for last-minute hugs, which he gave from the saddle, his strong hands lifting each girl up for a quick embrace. Then, with a touch of his hat to Eleanor, he rode off, quickly disappearing among the rolling hills that surrounded the ranch. The day passed without incident. Eleanor kept the girls busy with lessons and baking, as promised. By evening, however, she found herself glancing repeatedly toward the window, scanning the horizon for signs of Garrett's return. "He won't be back tonight," Mrs. Mitchell said matter-of-factly as she served supper. "The river will be too high. He's likely staying in town." Eleanor nodded, accepting the older woman's assessment. "I've told the girls as much. We'll continue as normal tomorrow." "See that you do," Mrs. Mitchell replied, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. "Routine is important, especially for children when their father's away." After putting the twins to bed with extra stories to compensate for Garrett's absence, Eleanor found herself restless. The house felt different without his solid presence, larger and somehow less secure. She checked the doors and windows twice before retiring Garrett's warning about Reynolds echoing in her mind. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams fragmented and uneasy. Just after midnight, she woke suddenly, certain she had heard a sound. Lying still, she listened intently. There it was again, a faint clanging from the direction of the barn. Eleanor rose and moved to the window. The moon was nearly full, illuminating the yard in silvery light. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then movement caught her eye, two shadowy figures near the corral where Monarch was being kept. Her heart pounding, Eleanor pulled on her robe and shoes. Common sense told her to wake Jim or one of the other ranch hands who slept in the bunkhouse. But that would take precious time, and the figures were already at the corral gate. Descending the stairs as quietly as possible, Eleanor found Mrs. Mitchell in the kitchen, a shotgun in her hands. "You heard it too," the housekeeper said, her voice a terse whisper. Eleanor nodded. "Two men by the corral." "Rustlers, most likely." Mrs. Mitchell checked the shotgun's loading mechanism with practiced ease. "Or Reynolds's men causing trouble while Garrett's away. What should we do?" "You stay here. I'll fire a warning shot. That usually scares them off." "And if it doesn't?" Eleanor asked, her mind racing. "If they're after Monarch, we can't let them take him. Garrett said he's crucial to the herd's future." Mrs. Mitchell's expression was grim in the dim kitchen light. "Then we do what needs doing. This isn't Boston, Miss Sinclair. On the frontier, women protect what's theirs." The simple statement struck Eleanor with unexpected force. What's theirs? In just 2 weeks, she had come to feel that Sullivan Ranch was in some small way hers to protect as well. "I'm coming with you," she decided. "Two are more intimidating than one." Mrs. Mitchell didn't argue, merely handed Eleanor a smaller rifle from a cabinet near the door. "Know how to use this?" "No," Eleanor admitted, "but they don't need to know that." A ghost of a smile touched the housekeeper's lips. "Follow my lead. Stay in the shadows. If I tell you to run, you run back to the house and the girls." "Understood." Eleanor nodded, gripping the unfamiliar weapon. They slipped out the back door and made their way toward the barn, using outbuildings for cover. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see the two men more clearly, both wearing bandanas over their faces, one holding a lantern, the other working on the corral gate. Mrs. Mitchell stepped into a patch of moonlight, the shotgun raised to her shoulder. "That's far enough," she called, her voice steady and authoritative. "This is Sullivan property. State your business or start running." The men froze then, the one at the gate straightened slowly. "Easy now, ma'am. We're just looking for a stray horse. Thought it might have wandered in here." "At midnight, with your faces covered," Mrs. Mitchell's tone dripped with skepticism. "Try again." The men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. Then the one with the lantern made a sudden movement toward his belt. Mrs. Mitchell fired the shotgun into the air without hesitation. The blast shattered the night's stillness, echoing across the ranch yard. "Next one won't be a warning," she said coldly. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the second man raised his hands. All right. We're leaving. No need for bloodshed." As they backed away, the man with the lantern dropped something, a folded paper that fluttered to the ground in the breeze. Neither intruder seemed to notice as they retreated hastily toward horses tethered beyond the barn. Eleanor and Mrs. Mitchell maintained their positions until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did the housekeeper lower the shotgun. "You did well," she said to Eleanor, her tone holding newfound respect. "Not many city women would have kept their nerve." "I'm not sure I had much choice," Eleanor replied honestly, still gripping the rifle with white knuckles. As Mrs. Mitchell went to check on Monarch and the other animals, Eleanor approached the spot where the paper had fallen. In the moonlight, she could just make out official-looking print. She picked it up and unfolded it to reveal a document with legal terminology, something about water rights and property boundaries. Too complex to decipher in the dim light, she tucked it into her robe pocket for examination later. Whatever it was, it seemed unlikely that midnight visitors with legitimate business would be carrying such papers. By the time they returned to the house, the commotion had woken the twins, who stood wide-eyed at the top of the stairs in their nightgowns. "Was that thunder?" Clara asked, her voice small. "Just a warning shot," Mrs. Mitchell replied matter-of-factly. "Some trespassers needed reminding about property lines. Everything's fine now." Eleanor climbed the stairs and gathered both girls into a reassuring embrace. "Nothing to worry about," she soothed. "Let's get you back to bed. I'll stay with you until you fall asleep." Once the twins were settled again, Eleanor finally had a chance to examine the dropped document properly. By lamplight in her room, she spread it out on the small desk. It appeared to be a contract of sorts, a deed transfer for water rights to Sullivan Creek, supposedly signed by Garrett Sullivan. The document granted Victor Reynolds exclusive access to the creek's headwaters, effectively cutting off the Sullivan Ranch's primary water source. Eleanor stared at the signature, her blood running cold. It looked like Garrett's, similar to what she had seen on ranch papers, but something about it struck her as wrong. The flourish on the final N was too elaborate, the slant of the letters slightly off. A forgery, and a clever one at that. If filed with the county recorder's office while Garrett was away, it could create legal complications that might take months to unravel, months during which Reynolds could divert the creek's flow or limit Sullivan Ranch's access. Eleanor carefully folded the document and locked it in her small traveling desk. Come morning, she would show it to Mrs. Mitchell and Jim. Until then, she would keep watch, alternating with the housekeeper to ensure no one else approached the ranch under cover of darkness. As she settled into the chair by the window rifle across her lap, Eleanor reflected on how completely her life had transformed in just 2 weeks. From abandoned bride to armed guardian of a cattle ranch, it would have been laughable if it weren't so deadly serious. Yet underneath her fear and vigilance lay a surprising realization. She felt more alive, more purposeful than she ever had in Boston. Here her actions had immediate consequences. Here she was needed not just as a governess, but as a protector, a decision-maker, a woman of substance. And if Garrett Sullivan's face came to mind as she thought about what she was protecting, if his trust in her filled her with pride and determination, well, that was something to examine another time when danger wasn't lurking just beyond the circle of lamplight. Morning arrived with no further incidents, though Eleanor and Mrs. Mitchell had maintained their vigil through the night, taking turns napping while the other watched. As the first rays of sunlight spilled across the ranch yard, Eleanor showed the forged document to Jim and Mrs. Mitchell in the kitchen. "Reynolds?" Jim growled after examining the paper. "Has to be. He's been after that water access for years." "But why forge a document?" Eleanor asked. "Surely he must know Mr. Sullivan would contest it." Mrs. Mitchell's weathered face was grim. "Delay tactics. Even if Garrett proves it's a forgery, it could tie up the water rights in court for months. We're heading into summer. Without reliable water access, we'd lose half the herd by August. We need to get this to Mr. Sullivan right away," Jim decided. "I'll ride to town myself." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "You need to stay here with the men. If those intruders return, or if this was just the first move in a larger plan, the ranch needs protection." She straightened her shoulders. "I'll go." Mrs. Mitchell studied her with sharp eyes. "You alone. It's 20 miles to Cheyenne, girl." I can ride," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "And I can describe exactly what happened last night. Besides, Mr. Sullivan needs to know about this immediately, and Jim is needed here." After some debate, They agreed it was the best option. Jim saddled Daisy the gentle mare Eleanor had ridden before and provided simple directions to Cheyenne. Mrs. Mitchell packed food and a canteen of water, while Eleanor changed into the most practical of Rebecca's riding clothes, a divided skirt that allowed for comfortable riding astride. "I'll care for the girls," Mrs. Mitchell assured her as she mounted. "Just get that paper to Garrett and explain what happened. And Eleanor?" The use of her given name from the housekeeper was unexpected. "Be careful. Reynolds has men all over the county. If they realize what you're carrying—" "I understand." Eleanor tucked the document securely inside her jacket. "I'll be as quick and discreet as possible." The journey to Cheyenne took most of the day. Eleanor rode steadily, following the main trail and stopping only briefly to rest Daisy and eat a small portion of the food Mrs. Mitchell had packed. By mid-afternoon, the buildings of Cheyenne appeared on the horizon, a welcome sight to her saddle-sore body. The town was larger than she had expected, with substantial brick buildings lining the main street alongside more rustic wooden structures. People bustled about their business merchants, cowboys, ladies in fashionable dresses, and rough-looking men whose purposes were less evident. Eleanor asked directions to the veterinarian's office from a shopkeeper who pointed her toward a small building near the edge of town. Her heart pounding with anticipation of seeing Garrett again, purely due to the urgency of her news, she told herself she urged Daisy in that direction. Dr. Miller's office was empty except for a young assistant who informed her that the doctor and Mr. Reuter Sullivan had left for the ranch early that morning. "They must have passed each other on different trails," the assistant explained. Dr. Miller was concerned about the bull and didn't want to waste time. Disappointment and concern washed over Eleanor. If Garrett was already en route to the ranch, she had missed him entirely. And now she was alone in Cheyenne, with a forged document and no clear next steps. "Is there a law office in town?" she asked. "Or a county recorder?" "Both," the assistant replied. "Judge Parker's office is down the street. He handles legal matters, and the county records are kept at the courthouse on Main Street." He eyed her curiously. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" "Yes, thank you," Eleanor assured him, unwilling to share ranch business with a stranger. "I appreciate your help." Outside, she considered her options. If Garrett was already returning to the ranch, her most pressing task was to find a safe place for the night and return home in the morning. Yet something pulled her toward the county recorder's office. What if Reynolds' men had already filed the forged document? A few hours' delay in contesting it might be costly. Decision made, Eleanor secured Daisy at a hitching post and made her way to the courthouse. The county recorder, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up as she entered his office. "May I help you, ma'am?" "Yes," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady and confident. "I need to check if any documents have been filed recently regarding water rights to Sullivan Creek." The man raised an eyebrow. "Are you representing Sullivan Ranch?" "I'm the governess there," Eleanor replied truthfully. "Mr. Sullivan is concerned about possible fraudulent filings." The recorder hesitated, then nodded. "Let me check the recent submissions. Water rights would be under property transactions." As he shuffled through a cabinet of papers, the office door opened behind Eleanor. She turned to see a man in an expensive suit enter a man whose face, despite 2 years of correspondence, she had never seen in person until this moment. Thomas Blackwell. He was handsome, in a conventional way, tall, with neatly trimmed brown hair and a well-groomed mustache. His clothes spoke of wealth and position, though perhaps less prosperity than his letters had suggested. Most striking was his expression of utter shock at seeing her. "Eleanor!" He recovered quickly, his face arranging itself into a polite mask. "Miss Sinclair, this is unexpected." Eleanor felt strangely calm, as if this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment she stepped off the train in Cheyenne. "Mr. Blackwell," she acknowledged coolly. "Indeed it is." The recorder looked between them, clearly sensing the tension. "You two are acquainted?" "Formerly," Eleanor said before Thomas could respond. "Mr. Blackwell and I had a brief correspondence that ended rather abruptly." She turned back to the recorder. "About those water rights." "Ah, yes." The man pulled out a document. "Nothing filed in the past month regarding Sullivan Creek. The last transaction was 3 years ago when Mr. Sullivan registered his water access rights." Relief washed over Eleanor. They had intercepted the forgers before the document could be filed. "Thank you," she said. "That's very helpful." Thomas remained by the door, his expression now calculating. "Miss Sinclair, perhaps we could speak privately. I admit I'm curious about your current circumstances." Every instinct warned Eleanor against being alone with Thomas, yet this might be her only opportunity to understand the connection between her former fiancé and Reynolds, knowledge that could help protect Sullivan Ranch. Briefly, she agreed, "I have pressing business to attend to." They stepped outside the courthouse onto the boardwalk. The afternoon sun cast long shadows down the main street, and the bustle of town life continued around them, oblivious to the personal drama unfolding in their midst. "You look well," Thomas began awkwardly. "I had wondered what became of you after you abandoned me at the station with nothing but a telegram," Eleanor finished for him, surprised by her own composure. The man who had once held her future in his hands now seemed smaller, somehow less consequential. Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It was poorly handled, I admit, but circumstances left me little choice. My financial situation had become untenable." "So I've heard," Eleanor replied, "though that doesn't explain why you chose to inform me only after I'd traveled thousands of miles." "I had hoped things might improve before your arrival." He adjusted his collar nervously. "When they didn't, I couldn't in good conscience bind you to a man who could no longer provide the life I'd promised." The explanation was reasonable on its surface, yet Eleanor detected something beneath it, a calculation that had nothing to do with her welfare. "And now," she asked, "I understand you're involved with Victor Reynolds in some capacity." Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. "How would you know that?" "Wyoming is a small territory, Mr. Blackwell. Word travels." She met his gaze directly. "As does news of forgery and attempted land theft." His face paled visibly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Eleanor took a calculated risk. 2 men were caught at Sullivan Ranch last night with a forged deed transfer for water rights, a transfer supposedly signed by Garrett Sullivan, granting those rights to Victor Reynolds. "And you assume I'm involved because you're Thomas Blackwell, manager of Cheyenne Bank and Trust, which holds the mortgage on Sullivan Ranch. Because you've denied reasonable extension requests while informing Victor Reynolds of potential foreclosure opportunities. And because you're standing here now in the county recorder's office, likely checking whether your forged document has been filed." Thomas's expression hardened. "You've been busy since our engagement ended. Quite the ranch defender now, aren't you? Is Sullivan paying you well for your services?" The implication in his tone made Eleanor's cheeks flush with anger. "Mr. Sullivan employs me as governess to his daughters, a position I accepted after finding myself stranded by your cowardice. Any defense I offer his property comes from principle, not payment." "Principle?" Thomas scoffed. "You know nothing about the realities of business out here, Eleanor. Sullivan is finished. His ranch is mortgaged to the hilt, his prize bull is dying, and his water rights are contested. Reynolds will have that land by summer's end, one way or another. Why? Eleanor demanded. What does Victor Reynolds want with Sullivan Ranch that's worth criminal actions to obtain it? Thomas glanced around, then lowered his voice. The railroad, Eleanor. The new spur line from Denver to Helena will cut through either Reynolds's property or Sullivan's. Whichever ranch secures the right-of-way stands to make a fortune in shipping contracts and land value increases. The revelation stunned Eleanor. This wasn't merely about water rights or a personal vendetta. It was about the future of the entire region. The railroad would transform whichever property it crossed, turning remote ranch land into a vital transportation hub. Does Garrett know this? She asked. Thomas's lips curved in a humorless smile. Sullivan is too proud to see what's in front of him. He thinks this is still about his wife choosing him over Reynolds years ago. He doesn't understand that in business the personal is merely leverage. The casual cruelty of the statement crystallized everything Eleanor had come to understand about the man she had nearly married. Thomas Blackwell saw people as pieces on a chessboard, valuable only for their utility in achieving his goals. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, stepping back. "It clarifies many things." "Eleanor," Thomas's voice stopped her. "Be careful. Reynolds is not a man to cross, and Sullivan is not worth your loyalty. When his ranch fails, and it will, where will that leave you? Without position, without prospects, alone in a territory that devours the weak." "I'm not as weak as you imagine, Mr. Blackwell." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Nor as calculating as you appear to be. Good day." She turned and walked away, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. She needed to get this information to Garrett immediately. But first, she had to secure lodging for the night. The afternoon was waning, and returning to the ranch before dark was impossible. The Silver Creek Hotel, the same establishment she had been unable to afford on her first night in Cheyenne, now stood as her best option. With the small amount of money Garrett had insisted she carry for emergencies, Eleanor secured a modest room for the night. Alone in the small space, she finally allowed herself to process the day's events. Meeting Thomas had been jarring yet strangely anticlimactic. The man she had once agreed to marry now seemed like a stranger, and not a particularly admirable one. What troubled her more was the conspiracy he had inadvertently revealed. If the railroad was indeed planning a spur line through the region, the stakes were far higher than she had realized. Reynolds wasn't merely trying to expand his ranch or settle an old score. He was positioning himself for a transformation that would make him one of the most powerful men in the territory. And Garrett, focused on the immediate challenges of running his ranch and raising his daughters, might not even be aware of the larger forces aligned against him. As darkness fell over Cheyenne, Eleanor sat by the window of her hotel room gazing out at the town lights. Tomorrow she would return to Sullivan Ranch with information that might change everything. For now, all she could do was guard the forged document and prepare herself for whatever challenges lay ahead. Her thoughts drifted to Garrett, his quiet strength, his unwavering devotion to his daughters, his trust in her despite their brief acquaintance, and the twins with their copper curls and inquisitive minds who had embraced her so completely. In just 2 weeks, these 3 people had become more important to her than she could have imagined possible. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Because if Thomas was right, if Sullivan Ranch was truly on the brink of failure, then the fragile happiness she had found there might prove as ephemeral as her former engagement. No, Eleanor decided firmly. She would not accept that outcome. Whatever complications lay ahead, she would face them alongside Garrett and the twins, not just as their governess, but as someone who had come to care for them deeply. With that resolution firm in her mind, Eleanor finally allowed herself to rest, knowing tomorrow would bring challenges that would require all her courage and resourcefulness. Dawn broke clear and bright over Cheyenne, painting the eastern sky in hues of pink and gold. Eleanor had risen early, eager to begin the journey back to Sullivan Ranch. After a quick breakfast in the hotel dining room, she retrieved Daisy from the livery stable and set out the forged document and her newfound knowledge secure in her possession. The return journey seemed shorter somehow, perhaps because her mind was so occupied with what she would say to Garrett. How would he receive the information about the railroad? Would he already know? And how would he react to her confrontation with Thomas? As the familiar outline of Sullivan Ranch appeared on the horizon, Eleanor felt a surge of emotion that took her by surprise. In just 2 weeks, this place had become home in a way Boston never had. The realization both comforted and unsettled her. She was spotted as she approached. One of the ranch hands called out, and within moments, the twins came running from the house, their copper curls flying behind them. "Miss Eleanor, you're back!" Clara's joyful cry carried across the yard. Eleanor dismounted, wincing at the stiffness in her legs from the long ride. Before she could fully gain her balance, she was engulfed in enthusiastic embraces from both girls. "We were worried," Charlotte said solemnly. "Papa said you were very brave to go to town alone." "Papa's back?" Eleanor asked, relief washing over her. Clara nodded vigorously. "He came home yesterday with Dr. Miller. They gave Monarch medicine, and he's better already." "That's wonderful news," Eleanor said sincerely. The bull's recovery removed at least one immediate threat to the ranch's prosperity. "Eleanor." The deep voice drew her attention to the porch, where Garrett stood watching. His expression was difficult to read, relief mingled with something more complex. He descended the steps and approached his eyes, never leaving her face. "Welcome back," he said simply. "You had us concerned." "I'm sorry for any worry I caused," Eleanor replied. "After finding you had already left town, I thought it best to stay overnight, rather than risk the trail in darkness." Garrett nodded. "A wise decision. Jim and Mrs. Mitchell told me everything, the intruders, the forged document, your journey to town." His blue eyes held hers intently. "That was a brave thing you did, Eleanor. Many would have simply waited for my return." "It seemed urgent," she explained, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. "And it proved to be more significant than we initially thought. I have important information to share with you." Understanding her meaning, Garrett turned to the twins. "Girls, why don't you help Mrs. Mitchell prepare lunch? Miss Eleanor and I need to discuss ranch business." Once the children had reluctantly departed, Garrett led Eleanor to the porch swing, the same spot where they had shared confidences before. The familiarity of the setting gave her courage. "I encountered Thomas Blackwell in town," she began without preamble. Garrett's expression darkened. "What did he want?" "He didn't seek me out. We met by chance at the county recorder's office." Eleanor described the encounter in detail, including Thomas's inadvertent revelation about the railroad. "He believes you're unaware of the planned spur line and its potential impact on the ranch." Garrett listened without interruption, his face increasingly grim. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "I had heard rumors," he admitted finally. "Whispers about railroad surveyors in the area, but nothing concrete." He ran a hand through his dark hair, that familiar gesture of frustration. "If Blackwell is right, it explains Reynolds's increased pressure these past months. The water rights, the loan terms, the attempted forgery, all of it aimed at gaining control of the ranch before the railroad's plans become public." "Can he succeed?" Eleanor asked, voicing her deepest fear. Garrett's jaw tightened. Not without a fight. Sullivan Ranch has been in my family for 2 generations. I won't lose it to the likes of Victor Reynolds or Thomas Blackwell. What will you do? First, secure our legal position. The forged document you intercepted gives us leverage. Attempted fraud is a serious charge. Then approach the railroad directly. If they're planning a spur line through this region, I need to understand exactly what that means for the ranch. His decisiveness reassured Eleanor. This was not a man who would be easily defeated, regardless of the forces aligned against him. I want to help, she said impulsively. In whatever way I can. Garrett studied her face, his expression softening. You already have, Eleanor, more than you know. The intensity in his blue eyes made her heart beat faster. She looked away, suddenly uncertain. I should check on the girls, she said, rising from the swing. They'll have questions about my journey. Garrett caught her hand, stopping her. Wait. He stood as well, still holding her hand in his. There's something else we need to discuss. Eleanor's pulse quickened at his touch, at the earnestness in his voice. Yes. When Jim told me you had gone to Cheyenne alone, He paused, seeming to search for the right words. I realized something that I should have acknowledged sooner. Something about you, about what you've come to mean to this ranch, to the girls, to me. Eleanor remained still, hardly daring to breathe. And what is that? That you're far more than a governess here. In just 2 weeks, you've become essential, not just for your teaching or your help with the children, but for your courage, your insight, your presence. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. When I thought you might be in danger, I couldn't bear it. The simple admission touched Eleanor deeply. I felt the same when I learned Monarch was ill, and you had to go to town, she confessed. Worried not just for practical reasons, but because, Garrett prompted gently when she hesitated, because in these 2 weeks, Sullivan Ranch has become home in a way no place ever has. And you and the girls have become... She faltered, uncertain how to express the depth of her feelings without seeming forward or presumptuous. Family, Garrett suggested, his voice low and hopeful. Eleanor nodded, unable to find words for the emotions swelling within her. Garrett released her hand only to frame her face gently between his palms. Eleanor, he said, his eyes searching hers, I know it's too soon. I know you came here escaping one hasty commitment, only to find yourself in the midst of our troubles. I have no right to ask anything more of you than you've already given. But I need you to know that if someday you could see your way to considering a more permanent place here, not as governess, but as... He couldn't seem to finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear in his eyes, in the tender way he held her face, as if she were something infinitely precious. Garrett, Eleanor whispered, her own hands rising to cover his. I came west seeking security, and found instead something I never expected, a purpose, a home, people to care for, who care for me in return. She took a deep breath. I don't need more time to know that whatever challenges lie ahead, I want to face them here, with you, with the girls. The joy that transformed his features was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual at first, then blazing with undeniable warmth. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he lowered his face to hers. Their first kiss was gentle, almost reverent, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Eleanor felt as if something fundamental had shifted within her, as if pieces of her life that had never quite aligned had suddenly fallen into perfect place. Papa, Miss Eleanor. Clara's voice from the doorway broke the moment. Mrs. Mitchell says lunch is ready, and it's impolite to keep everyone waiting. Garrett stepped back, though his eyes remained on Eleanor's face. "We'll be right there, Clara," he assured his daughter. As the child disappeared back into the house, Eleanor smoothed her skirts, her cheeks warm. "We should go in," she said, though part of her wished to remain in this moment to explore further the feelings that had been acknowledged between them. "Yes," Garrett agreed, offering his arm. "But this conversation isn't finished, Eleanor Sinclair. Not by a long measure." The promise in his voice sent a shiver of anticipation through her as she placed her hand on his arm and allowed him to escort her inside. Lunch was a cheerful affair with the twins, eager to share everything Eleanor had missed during her brief absence. Dr. Miller had declared Monarch on the road to recovery. Mrs. Mitchell had taught them to make apple dumplings. Charlotte had read an entire chapter book without help. Through it all, Eleanor was acutely aware of Garrett's presence across the table, of the warmth in his eyes when they met hers, of the private understanding that now existed between them. It was both thrilling and slightly terrifying to realize how completely her life had transformed in just 2 weeks. After the meal, as she helped clear the dishes, Mrs. Mitchell drew her aside. "So," the housekeeper said quietly, her sharp eyes missing nothing, "you and Garrett have come to an understanding, I take it?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm again. That is, we." Mrs. Mitchell's stern features relaxed into a rare smile. "No need to explain. I've watched it happening since you arrived." She paused, something vulnerable flickering across her weathered face. "Rebecca was like a daughter to me. When she died, I thought Garrett would never find happiness again. Never even look for it. I would never presume to replace her," Eleanor said quickly. "Of course not," Mrs. Mitchell agreed. "No one could, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for new joy in this house." She placed a work-roughened hand briefly on Eleanor's arm. "Rebecca would have approved, you know. She worried about leaving Garrett alone, about the girls growing up without a mother's guidance. In her final days, she asked me to pray for an angel to watch over them when she couldn't." The simple statement brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. "I'm hardly an angel, Mrs. Mitchell." "Perhaps not," the housekeeper conceded. "But you arrived when they needed you most, and you fought for this ranch as fiercely as if you were born to it. Seems answer enough to me." Before Eleanor could respond to this surprising endorsement, Clara burst into the kitchen. "Miss Eleanor, Papa says to come quickly. There's a man at the door asking for you, a city man in a fancy suit." Eleanor's heart sank. There was only one city man who would come seeking her at Sullivan Ranch. In the main room, she found Garrett standing rigidly by the door, his expression thunderous. Across from him, hat in hand, stood Thomas Blackwell. "Eleanor," Thomas said, his tone falsely warm, "I'm glad to find you well. When I heard you'd left town, I was concerned." "Mr. Blackwell," she acknowledged coolly. "What brings you to Sullivan Ranch?" Thomas glanced between her and Garrett, clearly sensing the tension. "I wanted to continue our conversation from yesterday. There are matters I believe we should discuss privately. Anything you have to say to Miss Sinclair can be said in my presence," Garrett stated, his voice hard. Thomas smiled thinly. "I think not. This concerns personal business between Eleanor and myself." "We have no personal business, Thomas," Eleanor said firmly. "Our engagement ended with your telegram. If you've come about ranch matters, Mr. Sullivan should certainly be present." Thomas's expression hardened. "Very well, since you insist on including Sullivan in private affairs." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "This is for you. A final settlement, you might say, for the inconvenience of our broken engagement." Eleanor made no move to take the envelope. "I neither need nor want your money, Thomas." It's not about want, Eleanor. It's about rights. As my former fiancé, you're entitled to compensation for the costs incurred in your journey west. A matter of honor. Honor, Garrett's voice was dangerously quiet. You speak of honor after abandoning a woman at a train station with nothing but a telegram. After conspiring with Reynolds to steal my land. Thomas straightened his facade of civility, slipping. Business, Sullivan, nothing personal. Though I admit finding Eleanor employed here was unexpected. One might almost suspect deliberate design. The implication was clear that Eleanor had somehow orchestrated her position at Sullivan Ranch to undermine Thomas's business interests. "How dare you?" Eleanor said, her voice shaking with anger. "You cast me aside without a second thought, and now you have the audacity to suggest I planned my own abandonment." "Think what you will," Thomas replied coldly, "but consider carefully where your loyalties lie. Sullivan Ranch is finished, whether through foreclosure water rights or the railroad's decisions. When it fails, where will that leave you? A governess without a position tainted by association with a failed rancher." He held out the envelope again. "This is your chance to return east with dignity and means." Eleanor stared at the envelope, then at the man holding it. The man she had once believed would be her husband. How little she had known him. How fortunate she had been to escape that fate. "I don't need your charity or your warnings, Thomas," she said with quiet dignity. "My place is here." Thomas's face hardened further. "With Sullivan. After knowing him a mere fortnight, have you learned nothing from your previous hasty commitment?" "I've learned to recognize a man of integrity when I meet one," Eleanor replied, "and to value actions over promises. Mr. Sullivan has shown me more respect and kindness in 2 weeks than you demonstrated in 2 years of correspondence." "Kindness?" Thomas scoffed. "Is that what you call it when a widower with 2 motherless children finds a stranded woman to exploit?" Before Eleanor could respond, Garrett stepped forward, his expression dangerous. "You've said enough, Blackwell. Leave my property now before I forget the presence of ladies." Thomas held his ground. "She deserves to know what she's choosing, Sullivan. About the ranch's finances, about Reynolds's claims, about the railroad." "I know everything," Eleanor interrupted. "About the bank loans, the water rights, the railroad plans. None of it changes my decision to remain here." Surprise flickered across Thomas's face, quickly replaced by cold calculation. "Then you're a fool. Both of you." He thrust the envelope into Eleanor's hands. "Take it or don't. But remember, when everything falls apart, that you had a choice." With that, he turned and left the door, closing firmly behind him. Silence filled the room for a long moment. Eleanor stared at the envelope in her hands, then deliberately crossed to the fireplace and tossed it into the flames. They watched as the paper blackened and curled, Thomas's final attempt at control reduced to ash. "You didn't have to do that," Garrett said quietly. "It was your right." "No," Eleanor disagreed. "It was an attempt to buy my silence, my compliance. I want nothing from Thomas Blackwell, not his money, not his advice, and certainly not his warnings." Garrett studied her face intently. "You meant what you said about staying?" "Every word." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Whatever challenges lie ahead for Sullivan Ranch, I want to face them with you. Not as a governess, but as my wife." Garrett supplied hope and uncertainty mingling in his voice. "Because after that confrontation, there will be talk. Reynolds and Blackwell will make sure of it." "Let them talk," Eleanor said with newfound certainty. "I've spent too much of my life concerned with appearances and propriety. What matters is the truth between us, Garrett. And the truth is, I've found more happiness, more purpose, more belonging in these 2 weeks at Sullivan Ranch than in all my years in Boston." Garrett crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her into his arms. This time their kiss held nothing of hesitation or restraint, only the passion and promise of a future they would build together, whatever obstacles might stand in their way. From the doorway came a small gasp, followed by Clara's delighted voice. "Charlotte, you were right. Papa does love Miss Eleanor." They broke apart to find both twins watching wide-eyed from the kitchen doorway, Clara bouncing with excitement, while Charlotte observed with quiet satisfaction. "Does this mean you'll be our mama now?" Clara asked eagerly. Eleanor looked to Garrett, uncertain how to respond to such a direct question. His blue eyes held hers, filled with love and hope. "That's a question I haven't properly asked yet," he said, his gaze never leaving Eleanor's face. "But if Miss Eleanor were willing, nothing would make me happier than for her to become your mother and my wife." "Well," Charlotte prompted when Eleanor remained silent, overcome with emotion. "Will you?" Eleanor looked at the little girl, so serious, so like her father, and at her exuberant twin, both watching expectantly. Then back to Garrett, whose face held a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Yes," she said simply. "Nothing would make me happier." Clara's whoop of joy echoed through the house as she launched herself at Eleanor for a hug. Charlotte followed more sedately, but her smile was radiant as she joined the embrace. Garrett's arms encircled all three of them, creating a circle of family that felt both new and somehow eternal, as if it had always been meant to be. In that moment, with the man she loved and the children who had claimed her heart, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that the broken engagement that had seemed like such a disaster had been, in truth, the greatest blessing of her life. It had led her here to Sullivan Ranch, to this family that needed her as much as she needed them. Whatever trials lay ahead, Reynolds, the bank, the railroad, they would face them together. And that made all the difference. News of Garrett Sullivan's engagement to the Boston governess spread through Wyoming territory like wildfire. Some neighbors offered sincere congratulations, delighted to see the widower finding happiness again. Others whispered about the hasty nature of the match barely 2 weeks after Eleanor's arrival, and wondered what had truly transpired at Sullivan Ranch. Victor Reynolds wasted no time capitalizing on the gossip. Within days, rumors circulated in Cheyenne that Eleanor had been Thomas Blackwell's abandoned fiancé, deliberately seeking employment at Sullivan Ranch to spite her former betrothed. More insidious whispers suggested financial desperation had driven both parties to the engagement, Garrett needing a mother for his children, before losing his ranch, Eleanor securing her future, before being cast out penniless. None of this malicious talk penetrated the peaceful routine that had settled over Sullivan Ranch. Spring blossomed fully across the rolling hills, painting the landscape in vibrant greens and wildflower hues. The cattle grew fat on fresh grass, new calves gambled alongside their mothers, and Monarch, the prized bull, regained his strength daily. Within the ranch house, a new harmony prevailed. The twins embraced Eleanor's transition from governess to future mother with enthusiasm, peppering her with questions about the wedding and their life afterward. Mrs. Mitchell, having given her blessing, softened further, sharing stories of Rebecca that helped Eleanor understand the remarkable woman whose place she would never fill, but whose legacy she would help continue. And Garrett, Eleanor, found him transformed. The permanent furrow between his brows eased, his rare smiles became more frequent, and a new lightness entered his step. Though the threats to the ranch remained sharing, the burden seemed to diminish its weight. One evening, a week after their engagement, Eleanor found Garrett in his study, surrounded by maps and documents. The intensity of his concentration reminded her of their more pressing concerns, concerns temporarily overshadowed by personal happiness. "May I join you?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up, his face brightening at the sight of her. "Of course. I was just studying the survey maps of the region, trying to determine the most likely route for the railroad spur." Eleanor entered, settling into a chair beside his desk. "Have you reached any conclusions?" "A few." He gestured to the maps spread before him. "Given the terrain, there are only 3 viable paths through this area. 2 would cross Reynolds's property, 1 would cross ours, specifically the northern section where Sullivan Creek originates. The same area Reynolds has been trying to obtain through the bank and the forged water rights document," Eleanor noted. Garrett nodded grimly. "Exactly. If that section becomes the railroad's chosen route, its value will increase tenfold overnight. Reynolds knows this. He's positioning himself to either own the land outright or control its access." "What are our options?" Eleanor asked, deliberately using "our" rather than "your," a small but significant acknowledgement of their shared future. Garrett's expression softened momentarily at her choice of words before returning to business. "I've been considering 3 approaches. First, we could contest any railroad survey that crosses our property, using legal means to delay or prevent construction. Would that succeed? Temporarily, perhaps. But railroad companies have powerful political connections and the law of eminent domain on their side. We might delay them, but probably not stop them. The second option, negotiate directly with the railroad company, offer favorable terms for right-of-way access through our property, potentially securing shipping contracts and water access agreements that would benefit the ranch." Eleanor considered this. "That sounds promising. What's the third approach?" Garrett hesitated, his expression troubled. "We sell the northern section to Reynolds." "What?" Eleanor couldn't hide her shock. "After everything he's done to try to steal it from you—" "Hear me out," Garrett said, raising a hand. "If we sold it at a fair market value, which would be substantial given the railroad's interest, we could use those funds to expand southward, where water is more plentiful during summer months anyway. It would remove the immediate financial pressure from the bank and potentially end Reynolds' vendetta against the ranch." Eleanor studied his face, sensing there was more to this suggestion than practical considerations. "You're not seriously considering this option, are you?" Garrett sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't want to. The land has been in my family for generations. My father would turn in his grave at the thought of selling to a man like Reynolds. But—" He looked toward the door where the twins' laughter could be heard from the kitchen. "I have more than my pride to consider now. The girls, you, our future together." The weight of responsibility in his voice touched Eleanor deeply. "What would you do if you were making this decision solely for yourself?" she asked gently. "Fight," he answered without hesitation. "Contest every inch, negotiate every advantage, and never give Reynolds the satisfaction of taking what belongs to Sullivan Ranch." "Then that's what we should do," Eleanor said firmly, "even knowing it might mean financial hardship, legal battles, uncertainty for months or even years." Eleanor reached across the desk to take his hand. "Garrett, when I agreed to marry you, I wasn't agreeing to an easy life. I was choosing you, all of you, including your principles and your determination to protect what matters. If Sullivan Ranch means fighting for what's rightfully ours, then we fight." The resolution in her voice seemed to settle something within him. His fingers tightened around hers. "You continue to amaze me, Eleanor Sinclair. Most women would choose security over principle." "I'm not most women," she reminded him with a smile. "And I suspect I'm about to become even less conventional." Her expression grew serious again. "What's our next step?" "We need to confirm the railroad's actual plans," Garrett decided. No more relying on rumors or second-hand information. I'll ride to Denver next week to meet with the Union Pacific representatives directly. I'm coming with you, Eleanor said immediately. Garrett looked surprised. It's a 3-day journey each way. The girls will be fine with Mrs. Mitchell for a week. Eleanor finished for him. Garrett, if we're to be partners in life, we should be partners in this as well. Besides, having a woman present might change the dynamics of the meeting. Railroad executives are used to dealing with ranchers and businessmen, not couples presenting a united front. A slow smile spread across Garrett's face. You're right, and I admit I'd welcome your insight. You have a way of seeing through pretense that I sometimes lack. Then it's settled, Eleanor said, pleased by his ready acceptance. We'll go to Denver together. There's one complication. Garrett added, his expression growing somber again. Thomas Blackwell. As the bank manager holding our mortgage, he'll almost certainly get wind of our meeting with the railroad. He could call in our loan while we're away, creating a crisis that would force immediate action. Eleanor considered this, her mind working quickly. Then we need leverage against him, something to ensure he can't act while we're gone. What kind of leverage? The forged water rights document, Eleanor suggested. We have proof of attempted fraud that implicates both Reynolds and potentially the bank. If Thomas fears exposure, he might be persuaded to maintain the status quo until our return. Garrett studied her with new appreciation. That's remarkably strategic thinking. I was a schoolteacher in Boston, Eleanor reminded him with a hint of mischief. Managing 30 young ladies from prominent families required considerable political acumen. He laughed, a warm, genuine sound that still surprised her when she heard it. I can imagine. Very well, we'll approach Blackwell before our departure, make it clear that any action against the ranch in our absence would result in the forged document being presented to Judge Parker. As they continued planning, the evening settled around them, the familiar sounds of the ranch at dusk creating a peaceful backdrop to their strategizing. When Mrs. Mitchell called them for supper, they joined the twins at the table with renewed purpose, their shared resolve strengthening the bonds already forming between them. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Eleanor and Garrett sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. The spring air carried the scent of new growth and distant rain. There's something I haven't told you, Garrett said quietly, breaking a comfortable silence. About Reynolds. About why his vendetta against me goes beyond business or even his past with Rebecca. Eleanor turned to face him, noting the tension that had returned to his features. What is it? Garrett's gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon. 5 years ago, before Rebecca became ill, Reynolds approached me with a business proposition. He wanted to combine our ranches, a merger that would create the largest cattle operation in the territory. I refused. Why? Eleanor asked, sensing there was more to the story. Because his terms included more than land and cattle, Garrett said, his voice hardening. He wanted Rebecca to run the household, both households, to divide her time between our ranch and his. Understanding dawned on Eleanor. He never accepted that she chose you. Never. Even after years of marriage, 2 children, Garrett's hands clenched into fists. He believed she had made a mistake, that she would eventually see it and return to him. The merger was just his way of keeping her in his life. Did Rebecca know about the offer? Yes. She was furious, told me if I ever considered it, she would take the girls and leave us both. A faint smile touched his lips at the memory. Rebecca was gentle in most things, but fierce when it came to our family. Eleanor absorbed this new information, understanding now the personal nature of the conflict between the 2 men. Reynolds doesn't just want your land, she said slowly. He wants to destroy what you and Rebecca built together, to prove that she should have chosen him after all. Yes, Garrett agreed simply. And now, with you here with our engagement. He turned to face her, his blue eyes intense in the moonlight. It will only fuel his determination. He'll see it as me replacing Rebecca, moving on while he remains trapped in the past. Do you think he might become dangerous? Eleanor asked, a chill running through her despite the mild evening. Reynolds operates through proxies, men like Thomas Blackwell, or the hands who tried to plant the forged document. He's too conscious of his standing in the community to act directly. But yes, I think he might become more aggressive in his tactics. Eleanor considered this soberly. Then we need allies, people in the community who know the truth about Reynolds and will stand with us if needed. We have some, Garrett assured her. Dr. Miller, for one. Judge Parker suspects Reynolds's methods, though he's careful to remain impartial publicly. Several neighboring ranchers have had their own run-ins with him over the years. Good, Eleanor said decisively. Before we leave for Denver, we should speak with them, make sure they're aware of our concerns and ready to act if Reynolds makes a move while we're gone. Garrett studied her face in the moonlight, wonder and admiration evident in his expression. You know, when I offered you the position of governess, I thought I was gaining a teacher for my daughters. I never imagined I was also finding a strategist and partner for myself. Eleanor smiled, warmth spreading through her at his words. Life has a way of providing what we need, even when it's not what we thought we were looking for. Indeed it does, Garrett murmured, drawing her closer on the swing. Indeed it does. As their plans took shape in the days that followed, Eleanor found herself embracing this new role with unexpected enthusiasm. The quiet schoolteacher from Boston had been transformed by frontier challenges into someone more resourceful, more decisive, someone who understood that protecting those she loved sometimes required bold action. The journey to Denver would be the first test of their partnership beyond the boundaries of Sullivan Ranch. Whatever awaited them there, railroad executives, financial negotiations, or further schemes from Reynolds and Blackwell, they would face it together, a united front defending not just land and livelihood, but the future they had both chosen. The journey to Denver took 4 days, rather than the expected 3 delayed by spring rains that turned trails to mud and swelled creek crossings to dangerous levels. Eleanor and Garrett traveled by stagecoach, a bone-jarring, dusty mode of transportation that tested Eleanor's endurance. Yet she found herself enjoying the adventure, the changing landscapes of Wyoming and Colorado territories, and most of all, the uninterrupted time with Garrett away from the demands of the ranch. They spoke of everything during those long hours, childhoods, dreams, fears, hopes for the future. Eleanor learned about Garrett's father, a Civil War veteran who had come west seeking a fresh start, and his mother, a schoolteacher not unlike Eleanor herself. Garrett heard about Eleanor's years in the Boston orphanage, her determination to become educated despite limited resources, her brief teaching career cut short by Thomas's proposal. By the time they reached Denver, their understanding of each other had deepened in ways that might have taken months under normal circumstances. The shared discomfort, the mutual purpose, and the intimate confines of the stagecoach had accelerated their bond, transforming them from cautious partners to confidants and true allies. Denver itself impressed Eleanor with its bustling growth, a frontier city transforming into a commercial hub before their eyes. Their hotel, modest but clean, offered luxuries the ranch house lacked: hot running water, gas lighting, and restaurants serving cuisine from across the nation. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, Garrett confirmed as they settled into their separate but adjoining rooms. We meet with Howard Phillips, the Union Pacific Regional Director. His office is near the Capitol building. Eleanor nodded, smoothing her travel-wrinkled skirt. Do you think he'll be forthcoming about the railroad's plans? Doubtful, Garrett admitted. These men play their cards close, but even what he doesn't say might tell us something useful. Their meeting the next day proved Garrett's prediction accurate. Howard Phillips, a corpulent man with shrewd eyes and a politician's smile, welcomed them warmly to his oak-paneled office, but revealed little of substance. The Union Pacific is always exploring potential routes for expansion, Mr. Sullivan, he said, puffing on a cigar that filled the room with acrid smoke. Wyoming territory represents significant opportunities for development. I understand that, Garrett replied evenly. But I've heard specific rumors about a spur line through the Laramie Basin region directly affecting either my property or Victor Reynolds' adjoining ranch. Phillips's expression revealed nothing. Rumors abound in developing territories, Mr. Sullivan. Some prove accurate, others don't. Mr. Phillips, Eleanor interjected, her Boston accent and polished manners drawing the executive's attention. My fiancé and I have traveled a considerable distance to speak with you directly rather than relying on rumors. As landowners potentially affected by your company's decisions, we're simply seeking information that would help us plan our future investments. The subtle emphasis on investments was deliberate, suggesting financial opportunities that might interest the railroad man. Phillips studied her thoughtfully, reassessing the meeting now that Eleanor had revealed herself as more than a silent companion. Miss Sinclair, soon to be Mrs. Sullivan, Eleanor supplied smoothly. Miss Sinclair, Phillips continued, I appreciate your directness. While I cannot discuss confidential business matters, I can tell you that the Union Pacific is indeed considering a spur line through that region within the next 18 months. The exact route is still being determined by our surveyors. Garrett leaned forward. And the criteria for that determination? Phillips puffed his cigar before answering. Multiple factors: terrain suitability, construction costs, water access for steam engines. He paused meaningfully. And, of course, cooperation from local landowners. Cooperation meaning, Garrett prompted, reasonable terms for right-of-way access, minimal legal obstacles, potential partnerships for cattle shipping contracts. Phillips's gaze shifted between them. The Union Pacific prefers to work with forward-thinking ranchers who see the railroad as an opportunity rather than a threat. And if multiple landowners offer similar terms, Eleanor asked, how would you choose between them? Phillips smiled, appreciating her insight. An excellent question, Miss Sinclair. In such cases, we consider the stability and longevity of the operation. The Union Pacific builds relationships for decades, not years. We value partners with secure futures. The implication was clear. The railroad would choose the ranch they believed would survive and thrive long-term. Given the rumors about Sullivan Ranch's financial troubles, this subtly favored Reynolds. I see, Eleanor said, matching Phillips's smile with one of her own. Then you'll be interested to know that Sullivan Ranch is entering a period of significant expansion and investment. Our recent merger of family interests has strengthened our financial position considerably. Garrett glanced at her, momentarily surprised by this creative interpretation of their engagement, but quickly followed her lead. Indeed, we're implementing new breeding programs, exploring enhanced water management systems, and planning infrastructure improvements that would complement railroad development. Phillips's expression shifted interest, replacing polite dismissal. Is that so? I wasn't aware of these developments. We've been discreet, Eleanor explained, given the competitive nature of the cattle business. But with the railroad potentially changing the regional dynamics, we felt it was time to share our vision with key partners like the Union Pacific. For the next hour, Garrett outlined genuine improvements he had long planned for the ranch, but lacked capital to implement, while Eleanor artfully framed their engagement as a merging of Eastern investment with Western operational expertise. None of it was strictly false, though the scale and immediacy were certainly exaggerated. By the meeting's end, Phillips was visibly reconsidering his assessment of Sullivan Ranch's prospects. "This has been most informative," he said, rising to signal the conclusion of their meeting. "I'll certainly convey your plans to our planning committee. We expect to finalize route decisions within 3 months." "We appreciate your time," Garrett said, shaking the man's hand firmly. "And we hope you'll visit Sullivan Ranch personally before making any final determinations. Seeing the land firsthand often provides insights maps cannot." "A kind invitation," Phillips replied noncommittally. "Time permitting, I may do that." Outside the Union Pacific offices, Eleanor and Garrett walked in silence for several blocks, processing the meeting. Finally, Garrett guided her to a small park where they could speak privately. "That was masterful," he said, admiration evident in his voice. "The way you repositioned our engagement as a business merger, suggesting Eastern capital without actually claiming it." Eleanor smiled, a touch of mischief lighting her green eyes. "I simply presented our situation in terms a railroad man would appreciate. Nothing I said was untrue, merely framed advantageously. And my ranch improvements, you made them sound as if they were already underway, rather than dreams awaiting funding." "Plans in progress," Eleanor corrected gently. "Which they are in your mind, if not yet on the land. We just accelerated the timeline a bit." Garrett shook his head in wonder. "Remind me never to negotiate against you, Eleanor Sinclair." Her smile faded, replaced by seriousness. "Do you think it made a difference? Will the Union Pacific consider our property more favorably now?" "Perhaps," Garrett said thoughtfully. "At minimum, we've ensured they won't dismiss Sullivan Ranch outright based on rumors of financial instability. Phillips strikes me as a man who hedges his bets. He'll likely keep both options open, our land and Reynolds, until the last possible moment." "Which gives us time," Eleanor concluded. "Time to actually implement some of those improvements to demonstrate the ranch's viability." "Time we wouldn't have had otherwise," Garrett agreed. "But we still face the immediate challenge of the bank loan. Phillips mentioned 3 months until route decisions. Our next quarterly payment to Blackwell is due in 6 weeks." Eleanor considered this soberly. "Then our next stop should be financial, not just for show this time. My teacher's savings won't make a dent in the loan, but perhaps there are investors in Denver who might see the potential in Sullivan Ranch, especially with the railroad coming." "Investors would want partial ownership," Garrett warned. "After fighting so hard to keep the ranch intact, I'm reluctant to start carving off pieces for shareholders." "What about a cattle contract instead?" Eleanor suggested. "If we could secure an advance payment on future deliveries from a Denver meatpacking company, it might cover the bank payment without sacrificing any ownership." Garrett's expression brightened. "That might actually work. Morrison's Meatpacking has approached me before about guaranteed delivery contracts. I've avoided locking myself in, but under the circumstances—" "It could be the bridge we need," Eleanor finished. "Shall we pay them a visit while we're here?" The next 2 days passed in a flurry of business meetings across Denver. James Morrison, the meatpacking magnate, proved receptive to their proposal, offering an advance payment substantial enough to cover the upcoming bank installment in exchange for preferential pricing on Sullivan Ranch beef for the next year. Garrett negotiated terms that protected the ranch from price fluctuations while still offering Morrison's enough incentive to justify the risk. Their final evening in Denver, Eleanor and Garrett celebrated their successes with dinner at the hotel's restaurant, the finest meal Eleanor had enjoyed since leaving Boston. Candlelight softened Garrett's features, erasing the worry lines that had become so familiar. "To new beginnings," he toasted, raising his glass to hers. "And to the remarkable woman who has transformed my prospects in ways I never imagined possible." Eleanor touched her glass to his warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the wine. "To partnerships," she countered, "and to facing whatever comes next together." As they dined, neither noticed the man watching from across the restaurant, a well-dressed gentleman who observed their celebration with calculating eyes before slipping out to send a telegram to Cheyenne. The return journey to Sullivan Ranch seemed faster, their spirits buoyed by their accomplishments in Denver. The advance payment from Morrison's was secure in a bank draft tucked into Garrett's coat pocket. The Union Pacific executives were reconsidering Sullivan Ranch's viability. For the first time since Eleanor's arrival, the future seemed hopeful rather than precarious. They arrived home late on the 6th day, greeted by exuberant twins and a surprisingly warm welcome from Mrs. Mitchell. The household had functioned smoothly in their absence, with no sign of trouble from Reynolds or his men. "Nothing at all," Garrett confirmed with Jim as they unloaded the stagecoach. "No strangers near the property, no unusual activities. Quiet as Sunday morning," the foreman assured him. "Almost too quiet, if you ask me. Reynolds's men usually ride along our north boundary at least once a week, checking for weaknesses. But there's been no sign of them." Garrett frowned. "That is unusual. Keep the men alert, Jim. Reynolds doesn't abandon his interests without reason." That night, after the twins were asleep and the household settled, Garrett joined Eleanor on the porch swing, their customary place for private conversations. The spring night was mild, scented with sage and wildflowers. "Something isn't right," Garrett said without preamble. "Reynolds pulling back his men while we were gone. It's out of character." Eleanor had been thinking the same thing. Could he know about our meetings in Denver, about the advance payment from Morrison's? Possibly. Denver has eyes and ears and Reynolds has connections. Garrett's expression was troubled in the moonlight. But even if he knew why withdraw rather than intensify pressure, it doesn't make sense. Unless, Eleanor hesitated, a chilling thought occurring to her, unless he's planning something bigger, something that makes these smaller harassments unnecessary. Garrett turned to her sharply. "What are you thinking?" "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but Thomas's appearance here before we left Reynolds's unusual restraint, it feels coordinated somehow, as if they're waiting for something specific." Before Garrett could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the night's stillness. Jim appeared from the bunkhouse, rifle in hand, as a rider galloped into the yard. "Sullivan!" the man called, reining his horse to a stop. "Message from town." Garrett descended the porch steps, accepting the folded paper the rider extended. Eleanor followed, a sense of foreboding growing as she watched Garrett's face harden while reading the message. "What is it?" she asked when he remained silent. "Judge Parker," Garrett said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "There's an emergency hearing tomorrow morning regarding Sullivan Creek water rights. Reynolds has filed a formal claim supported by newly discovered documentation." "The forged document," Eleanor breathed. "But how? We have the original." "We have one version," Garrett corrected grimly. "Reynolds must have had duplicates prepared. And with us away in Denver, he seized the opportunity to file without immediate challenge," Eleanor finished, understanding dawning. "That's why his men stayed away. He didn't want anything to hasten our return, before the hearing could be arranged." Garrett turned to the messenger. "Tell Judge Parker I'll be there. First light." To Jim he added, "Saddle my fastest horse at dawn. I'll ride ahead to Cheyenne while Eleanor follows with the stagecoach." "I'm coming with you," Eleanor insisted. If Reynolds is presenting forged documents, the judge needs to hear from both of us about the night his men were caught at the ranch. Garrett hesitated, clearly torn between wanting her testimony and concern for her welfare. The ride to Cheyenne at night is dangerous, Eleanor. The trail. Then we'll leave now, she interrupted, determination hardening her voice. Together, before Reynolds can present his case unchallenged. The decision was made quickly after that. Within an hour, Eleanor and Garrett were mounted and riding toward Cheyenne, leaving Mrs. Mitchell with the still sleeping twins and strict instructions to keep everyone close to the house until their return. They rode through the night, pushing their horses as fast as safety allowed along the moonlit trail. Eleanor's body protested the punishing pace after days of stagecoach travel, but she ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on the urgency of their mission. Dawn was breaking as they reached Cheyenne, the eastern sky painted in streaks of pink and gold that belied the tension of their arrival. They rode directly to Judge Parker's office, dismounting stiffly from their exhausted horses. The judge, a tall, lean man with iron-gray hair and penetrating eyes, was clearly surprised to see them. "Sullivan, Miss Sinclair, I didn't expect you until the official hearing at 10. "We rode through the night, Your Honor," Garrett explained. "Upon learning of Reynolds's water rights claim, I believe he's attempting to commit fraud against my property using forged documents." Judge Parker's bushy eyebrows rose. "That's a serious accusation, Sullivan. Reynolds has filed what appears to be a legitimate deed transfer signed by you granting him access to the headwaters of Sullivan Creek." "A forgery," Garrett stated flatly. "I never signed any such document. In fact, Miss Sinclair and my housekeeper caught Reynolds's men attempting to plant a forged deed on my property while I was away in Cheyenne 2 weeks ago." The judge turned his penetrating gaze to Eleanor. "Is this true, Miss Sinclair?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor confirmed, straightening her travel-rumpled skirt. "Mrs. Mitchell and I interrupted 2 men at the corral late at night. They dropped a document as they fled a forged deed identical to what Mr. Reynolds has apparently filed with your office." Judge Parker's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, interest, perhaps, or concern. "I see. And this document, locked in my desk at the ranch," Eleanor admitted. "We didn't anticipate Reynolds having duplicates." "Convenient," came a smooth voice from the doorway. Victor Reynolds entered impeccably dressed, despite the early hour Thomas Blackwell a step behind him. Allegations of mysterious nighttime intruders, conveniently missing evidence. "Really, Sullivan, I expected better." "Reynolds," Garrett acknowledged coldly, "I'm not surprised to find you already here ready to press your fraudulent claim." "There's nothing fraudulent about it," Reynolds countered, producing a document from his coat pocket. "This deed transfer, properly signed and witnessed, grants me water rights to the headwaters of Sullivan Creek, rights you agreed to sell for debt relief from the bank." "I signed no such agreement," Garrett insisted, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, I've been fighting Reynolds's attempts to acquire that land for years. Why would I suddenly sell the most valuable water rights on my property?" "Financial necessity," Thomas Blackwell interjected smoothly. "Sullivan Ranch is mortgaged to the limit with payments frequently late. The bank's records clearly show the precarious state of Mr. Sullivan's finances." "Records you control," Eleanor pointed out, addressing Thomas directly for the first time. "Just as you controlled the timing of this hearing, waiting until we were away in Denver to file these false claims." Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable under her direct accusation, but Reynolds merely smiled. "The timing is irrelevant. The document speaks for itself." He handed the deed to Judge Parker. "You'll find everything in order, Your Honor." The judge examined the paper carefully, his expression revealing nothing. The signature appears to match your previous filings, Sullivan. Because it was copied from them, Garrett argued. Reynolds has had access to county records. He could easily have studied my signature on legitimate documents. Judge Parker glanced between the two ranchers, clearly weighing the contradictory claims. "This is most irregular," he said finally. "Without clear evidence of forgery, I'm inclined to recognize the deed as presented. However," he held up a hand as Garrett began to protest. "Given the serious nature of the accusations, I will delay final judgment until noon today. If you can produce this alleged forged document from your ranch by then, Mr. Sullivan, I will consider it in my deliberations." "That's impossible," Reynolds objected. "Sullivan Ranch is 20 miles from town. Even riding hard, they couldn't retrieve the document and return by noon." "Then perhaps you have nothing to worry about," the judge replied dryly. "Noon, gentlemen, my office." He nodded to Eleanor. "Miss Sinclair." Outside the judge's office, Garrett's expression was grim. "He's right. Even with fresh horses, we couldn't make it to the ranch and back by noon." "Then we need another approach," Eleanor said, her mind racing. "Another way to prove the forgery." Garrett paced the boardwalk, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Without the document itself, what proof do we have?" Eleanor watched Reynolds and Thomas emerge from the judge's office deep in conversation as they crossed the street toward the bank. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we need to focus less on proving our case and more on getting them to reveal theirs." "What do you mean?" Reynolds and Thomas are confident, too confident. They believe they've outmaneuvered us completely. People who feel that secure often become careless. She met Garrett's questioning gaze. "Let's give them a chance to make a mistake." For the next hour, Eleanor outlined her plan, a desperate gambit that depended as much on psychology as evidence. Garrett listened, initially skeptical, but gradually recognizing the potential in her approach. "It's risky," he said when she finished. "If they don't react as you expect, then we're no worse off than we are now," Eleanor pointed out. "The judge is already inclined to rule in Reynolds's favor without contradictory evidence. This at least gives us a chance." Garrett studied her face, admiration mingling with concern. "You continue to surprise me, Eleanor Sinclair. I never imagined that proper Boston schoolteacher harbored such a strategic mind." "Boston social circles are their own kind of battlefield," she replied with a small smile. "One learns to recognize weaknesses and leverage them appropriately." Their plan required 2 additional participants, quickly recruited Sheriff Davis, initially reluctant, but persuaded by Garrett's standing in the community, and Dr. Miller, who harbored his own suspicions about Reynolds after examining cattle mysteriously poisoned on Sullivan land the previous year. At precisely 11:45, Eleanor entered the bank alone, requesting an urgent meeting with Thomas Blackwell. His secretary, recognizing her from her previous visit, hesitated before escorting her to his office. Thomas looked up from his desk, surprise quickly masked by professional courtesy. "Miss Sinclair, this is unexpected. I thought you'd be frantically riding to your ranch to find that non-existent document." "That's precisely why I'm here," Eleanor said, taking a seat without invitation. "To save us both unnecessary effort." Thomas leaned back, wariness entering his expression. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "It's quite simple, Thomas. I know the truth about the forged deed, all of it. The men who created it when it was done, and most importantly, who ordered it." She met his gaze steadily. "And I'm prepared to testify to all of it before Judge Parker in 15 minutes. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Thomas's face. "You're bluffing. You have no proof." "Don't I?" Eleanor reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded paper. One of Reynolds' men proved remarkably forthcoming when Sheriff Davis mentioned potential prison time for forgery. Signed confession naming you as the middleman who paid them on Reynolds's behalf. She kept the paper folded vital since it was actually the deed to her parents' modest home in Boston, the only official document she had with her. But Thomas couldn't know that. "Impossible," he said, but sweat had appeared on his brow. "Reynolds would never implicate you," Eleanor finished, perhaps not intentionally. But men under pressure make mistakes, and Reynolds has made several, including underestimating what I would do to protect Sullivan Ranch. Thomas stood abruptly, moving to the window. "What do you want, Eleanor?" "The truth," she said simply. "In writing. A statement acknowledging the deed is forged, that you and Reynolds conspired to file it while Garrett and I were away. In exchange, your name will be omitted from the public record. Reynolds will face the consequences alone. And if I refuse? Then you both face charges. Banking fraud carries substantial penalties, Thomas. Your career would be over." He turned back to face her anger and fear warring in his expression. "You've changed," he said finally. "The Eleanor Sinclair I corresponded with would never have attempted such a brazen bluff." "You're right," she acknowledged, rising to face him. "She wouldn't have. But she also wouldn't have survived 2 weeks on the frontier. We all adapt to our circumstances, Thomas, some more honorably than others." Their eyes locked in silent battle, former fiancés, now adversaries, across an unbridgeable divide. Whatever Thomas saw in Eleanor's steady gaze made him flinch first. "I need guarantees," he said, his voice lower. "Written assurance that my name stays out of this." "Drafted by Judge Parker himself," Eleanor promised. "But we need to hurry. The hearing reconvenes in 10 minutes. When Eleanor entered Judge Parker's office at noon precisely, she was accompanied not only by Garrett Sheriff Davis and Drs. Miller, but also by a visibly shaken Thomas Blackwell. Victor Reynolds, already seated before the judge's desk, rose in alarm at the unexpected assembly. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Blackwell, what are you doing?" Thomas avoided his gaze, addressing Judge Parker instead. "Your Honor, I need to make a statement regarding the Sullivan Creek water rights deed." What followed was a confession that exceeded even Eleanor's hopes. Thomas admitted not only that the current deed was forged, but that Reynolds had been systematically attempting to undermine Sullivan Ranch through financial manipulation, forged documents, and even sabotage of cattle and water sources. "He's become obsessed," Thomas concluded, his professional demeanor crumbling under the weight of his revelations. What began as business competition became personal after Rebecca Sullivan died. He blamed Garrett for her death, said if she'd married him instead, she would have had access to better doctors, better care. Throughout the confession, Reynolds sat rigidly, his handsome face twisted with fury and disbelief. When Thomas finished, he exploded to his feet. "You spineless coward," he shouted. "After everything I've done for you, the money I've paid—" "Mr. Reynolds," Judge Parker interrupted sharply, "I suggest you remain silent before you further incriminate yourself. Sheriff Davis, please take Mr. Reynolds into custody pending formal charges of forgery and attempted fraud." As the sheriff moved to comply, Reynolds turned his venomous gaze to Eleanor. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Sullivan Ranch will still fail. The railroad will be making their own assessment of the situation," Eleanor replied calmly, "without your influence clouding their judgment." After Reynolds had been escorted out, Judge Parker addressed the remaining parties. "Mr. Blackwell, while I appreciate your eventual honesty, your role in this affair cannot be overlooked. I will be forwarding a full report to the Banking Commission." Thomas nodded, resigned to the professional consequences of his actions. "I understand, Your Honor. As for you, Sullivan," the judge continued, "all claims against your water rights are hereby dismissed. The deed in question will be marked fraudulent in county records." He permitted himself a small smile. "I must say I've suspected Reynolds's methods for some time, but proof has been elusive. Well done." Outside the courthouse, Garrett pulled Eleanor into an embrace, heedless of the townspeople passing by. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Absolutely magnificent." Eleanor returned his embrace, relief and triumph washing over her in equal measure. "We did it together," she reminded him. "All of us." She glanced at Dr. Miller and Sheriff Davis, who stood nearby with matching expressions of satisfaction. "Indeed you did," the sheriff agreed. "Reynolds has been skirting the law for years. About time someone stood up to him properly." As the men discussed the legal implications of Reynolds's arrest, Eleanor noticed Thomas standing alone at the edge of the courthouse steps, uncertainty in his posture. Despite everything, she felt a pang of pity for the man whose life had just imploded. "Excuse me," she murmured to Garrett, crossing to where Thomas waited. "What happens now?" he asked when she approached, his voice hollow. "You start over," Eleanor said simply. "Somewhere new, perhaps, with lessons learned." Thomas studied her face. "You could have destroyed me completely. Why didn't you?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Because vengeance solves nothing, and because once I believed you were a good man beneath your ambition. Perhaps you can be again without Reynolds's influence." "And you?" Thomas asked. "Will you really marry Sullivan, become a rancher's wife so far from civilization?" Eleanor glanced back at Garrett, who was watching them with concern, but making no move to interrupt. "Yes," she said with quiet certainty. "I've found where I belong, Thomas. It wasn't what I expected, but it's where I'm meant to be." Thomas nodded slowly. "I hope he deserves you." He does," Eleanor assured him. "Goodbye, Thomas." As she rejoined Garrett, slipping her hand into his, Eleanor felt the last shadows of her past life fall away. Ahead lay challenges, still rebuilding the ranch's finances, preparing for the twins' future, navigating the inevitable changes the railroad would bring to the region. But they would face them together, stronger for the trials they had already overcome. The battle for Sullivan Ranch was won. The battle for their future was just beginning. 3 months after Victor Reynolds's arrest, Sullivan Ranch bloomed with activity and renewed purpose. The northern pastures, no longer threatened by water rights disputes, thrived with lush summer grass. The cattle grew fat and healthy, promising a profitable autumn sale. Monarch, fully recovered from his illness, had sired a new generation of calves that showed every sign of inheriting his superior qualities. Within the ranch house, preparations for an August wedding transformed the usual routine. Mrs. Mitchell, having fully embraced Eleanor's place in the family, turned her considerable organizational skills to ensuring the celebration would be memorable. The twins fluttered about like copper-winged butterflies, testing their mother-to-be's patience with endless questions about dresses, flowers, and whether they could wear their hair like grown-up ladies for the occasion. Eleanor found herself embracing these domestic details with unexpected enthusiasm. The Boston school teacher, who had once defined herself by intellectual accomplishments, now took equal pleasure in creating a true home, in watching Clara and Charlotte blossom under her care, in building a life partnership with Garrett that encompassed both the practical demands of ranch management and the deeper bonds of love and respect. The railroad question had resolved itself with surprising ease. Following Reynolds' disgrace, Union Pacific representatives had visited Sullivan Ranch, directly impressed by the improvements already underway with the Morrisons' meat-packing advance payment. After thorough surveys, they determined that the most economical route would cross a corner of Sullivan property, while leaving the valuable water sources intact. The compensation offered for the right-of-way, combined with preferential shipping contracts, ensured the ranch's financial stability for years to come. On a warm evening, 2 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor sat on the porch swing enjoying a rare moment of solitude. The setting sun painted the distant mountains in hues of purple and gold, while closer at hand, fireflies began their nightly dance above the garden Mrs. Mitchell had helped her plant. The screen door opened, and Garrett emerged carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "The girls are finally asleep," he reported, handing her one of the glasses before settling beside her on the swing. Charlotte insisted on one more chapter of Little Women, and Clara wouldn't be left out. "They love that story," Eleanor said, smiling. "Charlotte sees herself in Serious Joe, while Clara is convinced she's exactly like impulsive Amy. And they both want to be Beth because she plays the piano," Garrett added, demonstrating his own familiarity with the novel Eleanor had been reading to the twins. "Though I've had to promise no one will get scarlet fever in our version." Eleanor laughed softly. A wise amendment. She sipped her lemonade, enjoying the tart sweetness. "It's good to see them so engaged with books. Rebecca would be pleased." The mention of his late wife no longer brought shadows to Garrett's eyes. Instead, he nodded in agreement. "She would, and she'd be grateful for how you've continued her educational plans for them." He paused, studying Eleanor's profile in the fading light. "You never ask me to put away her things to remove her photographs. Most women would want to make the house entirely their own." "It is my home," Eleanor said simply. "But it was hers first, and the girls deserve to grow up knowing their mother through memories and stories. I don't need to erase Rebecca to find my own place here." Garrett took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Have I told you today how remarkable you are, Eleanor Sinclair?" "Not since breakfast," she teased. "I was beginning to worry." He laughed, the sound rich and unguarded in a way it hadn't been when they first met. The grief and worry that had etched permanent lines around his eyes had eased in recent months, replaced by a quiet contentment that deepened when he looked at her. 2 weeks, he said, his voice softening. 2 weeks until you're officially Mrs. Sullivan, though in every way that matters, you already are. Eleanor leaned into his side, comfortable in the intimacy they had built. "I never imagined when I stepped off that train in my ruined wedding dress that I would find this a family, a purpose, a man who sees me as a true partner rather than merely a wife. And I never imagined when I offered a desperate governess position to a stranded bride that I was meeting the woman who would transform not just my daughters' lives, but my own." Garrett's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Providence works in mysterious ways." "Indeed it does." Eleanor agreed, thinking of all the seemingly random events that had led to this moment: Thomas's rejection, the blizzard that trapped her in Cheyenne, the twins' exuberant collision with her skirts at the station. "Though I suspect Providence had help from 2 little matchmakers." Garrett chuckled. "Clara did ask me yesterday if she could call you Mama after the wedding. I told her that was entirely up to you." Eleanor's heart swelled at the question she had secretly hoped for, but would never have presumed to expect. "I would be honored," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Truly honored." They sat in companionable silence as twilight deepened around them, the rhythm of the swing matching their breathing. From the bunkhouse came the faint sound of a harmonica, one of the ranch hands playing a melancholy tune that floated on the evening air. "I have something for you," Garrett said, eventually reaching into his pocket. "I meant to wait until the wedding, but—" He produced a small velvet box, offering it to her with uncharacteristic hesitancy. Eleanor opened it to find a ring unlike any she had seen before, a band of gold supporting not a traditional diamond, but a small oval of deep blue stone flecked with gold, surrounded by tiny seed pearls. "It's lapis lazuli," Garrett explained. "My mother's ring passed down from her mother before her. The blue is for fidelity, the gold flecks for prosperity, the pearls for tears overcome by joy." He took the ring from the box. "I had it sized for you in Cheyenne last week. If you prefer something more conventional—" "It's perfect," Eleanor interrupted, extending her hand so he could slide the ring onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect. I've never cared for diamonds too cold, too hard. This has warmth and history." The ring settled into place as if it had always belonged there, the blue stone catching the last light of sunset. Garrett raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above where the ring now rested. "When I lost Rebecca," he said quietly, "I thought that part of my life was over, that I would raise the girls alone, run the ranch until they were grown, and find what contentment I could in fulfilling my responsibilities." His blue eyes, so like his daughter's, held Eleanor's gaze. "I never expected to love again, Eleanor. Never thought I could. But what I feel for you—" He paused, searching for words adequate to express emotions too complex for simple language. "It's different from what I shared with Rebecca. Not lesser, not greater, just different. A second chance. I never thought to have a companion I never dared hope for." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes at the simple honesty of his declaration. "I understand," she said softly. "What we've found together isn't a replacement for what was lost. It's something new built on the foundations of all that came before your life with Rebecca. My journey west. Even Thomas's rejection. Each step, painful or joyful, led us here." Garrett gathered her closer, his kiss conveying what words could not gratitude wonder, and a love that had grown not from youthful passion, but from mature appreciation of character, tested by adversity. When they parted, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, silver points against deepening blue. 2 weeks, Eleanor murmured, resting her head against his shoulder. "And then, forever." "Forever," Garrett agreed, his voice a promise in the gathering night. As they sat together watching the stars emerge, Eleanor reflected on the strange winding path that had brought her to this moment. From Boston orphan to educated teacher, to abandoned bride, to ranch governess, to beloved partner, each transformation had shaped her, strengthened her, prepared her for the next. The Eleanor Sinclair, who had boarded the train west with dreams of security and respectability, could never have imagined the woman she would become on the Wyoming frontier. That Eleanor had sought a husband, this one had found a true partner. That Eleanor had wanted stability, this one had discovered strength in facing uncertainty. That Eleanor had craved social acceptance, this one had learned the deeper value of being truly known and loved for exactly who she was. "What are you thinking?" Garrett asked, noting her contemplative silence. Eleanor smiled, lifting her hand to admire the ring that symbolized not just their coming marriage, but the union of East and West, past and future loss and renewal. "I'm thinking that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as our worst disappointments." "Wise words from a wise woman," Garrett said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "My wise woman." "Yours?" Eleanor agreed, settling more comfortably against him as night enfolded the ranch in velvet darkness, the promise of dawn already waiting beyond the eastern mountains. Now and always. In that moment of perfect contentment, with the man she loved beside her, and the home they would build together, surrounding them, Eleanor Sinclair, soon to be Eleanor Sullivan, offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the broken engagement that had led her to this place, this family, this love. Some journeys began with a single step. Hers had begun with a rejection, a ruined wedding dress, and a desperate rancher's plea. "Please come with me. My twins need a mother like you." Providence indeed worked in mysterious ways. And sometimes those mysteries led to the happiest of endings, which were in truth only beautiful beginnings.